Consider a scenario where you endure a painful medical procedure that lasts 30 minutes, and then reflect on that experience weeks later when recalling how unpleasant it was. You find yourself dwelling on the intensity of discomfort rather than the actual passage of time involved. Now imagine a different experience where you spend an entire weekend engaged in an activity that brings you little joy. Yet when someone asks you about it afterward, you struggle to recall specific details or even acknowledge how much time had actually elapsed during those 2 days. These seemingly contradictory responses reveal a fascinating quirk of human memory and evaluation known as duration neglect, a psychological phenomenon where the length of time spent experiencing an event has surprisingly little influence on how we judge and remember that experience overall. When we evaluate past experiences, our minds tend to focus intensely on the peak moments of emotion, whether positive or negative, and on how the experience concluded, while almost entirely disregarding the actual duration of the event. A 3-hour flight with a terrifying moment of turbulence becomes defined by that turbulence in memory, not by the hours of peaceful cruising that surrounded it. A vacation spent largely in hotel rooms becomes remembered for the single spectacular sunset witnessed on one evening, while the 40 other hours of ordinary time fade into obscurity. This peculiar weighting system in our brains appears to operate independently of logical evaluation, suggesting that our experiential memory and our real-time consciousness are fundamentally misaligned. We make major life decisions based on how we predict we will feel, yet the actual duration of those feelings carries almost no weight in our post-event assessment, a contradiction that persists despite our awareness of it and despite how profoundly irrational it seems upon examination. Imagine you've spent an entire day at an amusement park, moving from ride to ride, experiencing moments of genuine excitement mixed with long stretches of waiting in queues under the hot sun, navigating crowds, and dealing with the minor frustrations that accompany such outings. When evening arrives and you're asked to rate your experience, you find yourself recalling not the average of all those hours, but rather two specific moments. The peak moment when you felt the most intense joy, perhaps on the final roller coaster with the most thrilling drop, and the end of the day when you were leaving the park feeling tired but satisfied. Your overall memory of the day becomes disproportionately shaped by these two bookend moments, causing you to rate the entire experience far more positively than a rational calculation of all the moments combined would suggest. This phenomenon is called the peak-end rule, and it reveals something profoundly peculiar about how human memory actually constructs our sense of lived experience. The rule emerges from the way our brains encode memories, not as faithful recordings of continuous experience, but as snapshots and highlights that our unconscious mind selectively preserves. The peak moment captures our attention because it represents the most intense emotional activation, while the end moment serves as the final frame through which we view the entire narrative, creating a recency effect that disproportionately influences our overall judgment. Psychologists have demonstrated this effect repeatedly in laboratory settings, showing that people who experience painful medical procedures will remember them more favorably if the procedure ends with a slightly less painful period, even if the total pain experienced was technically greater. Consider the person who works diligently for decades, sacrificing present pleasures and experiences in order to accumulate wealth for a future that may never arrive as imagined, only to find themselves too old, too tired, or too cautious to actually spend the money they have worked so hard to obtain. They have denied themselves vacations, hobbies, time with loved ones, and simple joys throughout their productive years, telling themselves that someday, when they have enough, they will finally live the life they have always wanted. Yet when that moment arrives, when the retirement accounts are full and the restrictions theoretically lifted, they discover that the habits of deprivation have calcified into their identity so deeply that they cannot bring themselves to spend freely, or worse, they find that their health and circumstances have changed such that the experiences they once dreamed of are no longer possible or appealing. This is the savings paradox, the intense psychological conditioning that equates financial security with virtue and spending with moral failure becomes so ingrained that the original purpose of saving, which was to enable a better life, gets completely inverted. The means becomes the end, and the goal of living well transforms into the goal of merely accumulating. The person has essentially traded their youth for money, only to discover that money cannot purchase back the youth that has already slipped away. What makes this paradox so psychologically fascinating is that we understand it intellectually, we can articulate it clearly, and yet millions of people continue to live in this contradiction without resolution, as if the knowledge of the paradox itself is somehow insufficient to break the behavioral pattern. Society reinforces this trap constantly through cultural narratives that celebrate frugality and delayed gratification as moral imperatives, making it seem not just prudent, but righteous to deny oneself happiness. Imagine a society where everyone decides simultaneously that they will spend less money and save more of their income, driven by a collective desire for financial security and prudent resource management. On the surface, this seems entirely rational and responsible, a virtue that should be celebrated and encouraged at every level of economic life. Yet as this widespread thriftiness takes hold across the population, something unexpected and counterintuitive begins to unfold, something that economists and behavioral scientists have long observed with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment. When individuals save more and spend less, they are contributing less money to the circular flow of economic activity, which means businesses receive fewer customers and lower revenues, which in turn means companies must reduce their workforce and cut wages, which further reduces the overall spending power in the economy, which eventually leads to recession and unemployment that leaves people worse off financially than they would have been had they simply continued spending at moderate levels. The paradox lies in the fundamental disconnect between what is rational for any single individual and what proves catastrophic when everyone pursues that same rational strategy in unison, creating a collective action problem where the aggregate outcome contradicts the sum of individual intentions. The mechanism operates through a cascade of economic interdependence that most people fail to grasp intuitively, because we are taught from childhood that saving is virtuous and spending is wasteful, that restraint equals wisdom and consumption equals irresponsibility. We have normalized this paradox so completely that governments must actively encourage spending during economic downturns, essentially asking people to act against their deeply ingrained sense of financial prudence in order to prevent the very economic collapse that their rational thriftiness would otherwise tear. Consider the human experience of wealth and contentment across the landscape of modern societies, where we observe a peculiar phenomenon that has captivated economists and psychologists alike for decades. Within a single country at a given moment, wealthier individuals tend to report higher levels of life satisfaction and happiness than their less affluent counterparts, a relationship that appears straightforward and logical at first glance. Yet when we examine this same relationship across different countries, or when we track the same country over many decades as its overall wealth increases substantially, something remarkable occurs. The correlation between national wealth and national happiness essentially disappears or weakens dramatically. Nations that have doubled or tripled their economic output over 50 years report no significant increase in average happiness levels among their citizens, despite the objective reality that people possess more material goods, better healthcare, superior technology, and greater access to comfort than ever before in human history. This is the Easterlin paradox, named after economist Richard Easterlin, who first documented this phenomenon systematically in the 1970s. The mechanism underlying this strange disconnect operates through the lens of relative comparison and adaptation. Our sense of satisfaction with our financial circumstances does not emerge from an absolute assessment of our material conditions, but rather from a constant comparison with those around us and with our own past experiences. When everyone's wealth increases together at the societal level, the relative positions remain unchanged, and therefore the psychological benefits of increased wealth simply evaporate into thin air. Additionally, human beings possess a remarkable capacity for hedonic adaptation, whereby we quickly become accustomed to improved circumstances and reset our expectations upward accordingly. Consider the person who remains in an unfulfilling career for decades, watching colleagues discover new paths and find greater satisfaction. Yet when presented with compelling opportunities for advancement or change, they experience a strange paralysis that prevents them from even applying. Or think of the individual in a relationship that has grown stale and distant, who fantasizes about connection and intimacy with others, but when genuine possibilities for romantic alternatives present themselves, they suddenly retreat into the safety of their current situation with renewed commitment. This paradox emerges because better options represent something far more threatening than our current circumstances, however unsatisfactory they may be. When we inhabit a familiar situation, even one that causes us pain or limits our potential, we have developed an intricate understanding of its contours and limitations, and we have built elaborate psychological frameworks to justify remaining within it. The moment a genuinely superior alternative appears on the horizon, it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that our present suffering has been, to some degree, a matter of choice rather than circumstance, and this recognition carries tremendous psychological weight. Better options demand that we take responsibility for our unhappiness in ways that impossible situations never do, because they eliminate the comfortable excuse that we simply had no better path available. Furthermore, superior alternatives introduce uncertainty into our calculations, and the specific known misery of our current state suddenly seems less daunting than the unknown risks associated with pursuing something objectively better. We fear not the present pain, but rather the possibility that we might fail at grasping the better thing, or that achieving it might reveal us as inadequate, or that the transition itself might expose vulnerabilities we have kept carefully hidden. Consider the experience of choosing a restaurant for dinner with friends, a task that seems simple on the surface, yet reveals a fascinating split in human decision-making behavior. One person in the group quickly suggests the Italian place down the street, having eaten there before and knowing it serves good food at reasonable prices, and they feel satisfied with this choice immediately. Another person in the same group begins researching online reviews, comparing menus across 15 different establishments, reading detailed descriptions of dishes, checking ratings on multiple platforms, and weighing factors like ambience, service quality, and price-to-portion ratios against each other, all while the first person's suggestion sits unanswered. This is the paradox of the maximizer versus the satisficer, two fundamentally different approaches to decision-making that exist within human psychology and often within the same person depending on context. The satisficer operates by establishing a threshold of acceptable criteria and selecting the first option that meets those standards, experiencing genuine contentment with the outcome because they have achieved their goal of finding something good enough. Maximizer, by contrast, pursues an optimization strategy, driven by the internal logic that there exists somewhere a best possible option, and until every reasonable alternative has been thoroughly evaluated, settling for merely good is a form of failure. What makes this paradox psychologically fascinating is that research consistently demonstrates the maximizer often ends up less happy with their final choice than the satisficer, despite theoretically having made a more informed decision. The maximizer's decision process generates decision fatigue, creates opportunity cost regret by constantly wondering about paths not taken, and produces post-decision anxiety as they contemplate whether they truly selected the optimal option or not. Imagine sitting in a quiet room and repeating a single word aloud over and over again for 30 seconds or more. You might choose something simple like the word chair or water or butterfly, and as you continue to vocalize it repeatedly, something peculiar begins to unfold in your mind. The word, which moments ago carried clear meaning and conjured a distinct mental image, gradually loses its significance. The more you repeat it, the more it transforms into an empty sound, a mere collection of phonetic shapes devoid of meaning. Where there was once a coherent concept, there is now only the hollow echo of syllables, and the word becomes nearly unrecognizable to your own ears, as though you are hearing it for the very first time, yet simultaneously hearing it as a stranger's voice would. This phenomenon is called semantic satiation, and it represents one of the most peculiar vulnerabilities built into the architecture of human language and cognition. The mechanism underlying this experience involves the gradual neural fatigue of the specific brain cells responsible for processing the meaning of that particular word. When a concept is repeatedly activated in the brain without rest or variation, the neurons that encode that semantic representation become temporarily exhausted, similar to how a muscle fatigues after continuous exertion. This neural adaptation causes the semantic content to diminish until the word becomes merely a sound, stripped of its communicative power. Yet what makes semantic satiation truly paradoxical is how thoroughly it contradicts our intuitive understanding of language and meaning. We tend to assume that a word's meaning is stable and fixed, that it remains constant regardless of how many times we encounter or produce it. We expect our linguistic categories to persist and remain reliable, serving as the stable foundation upon which all communication rests. Imagine walking into a place you have visited countless times before, perhaps your own home or a familiar workplace, and suddenly everything feels completely foreign and strange, as though you have never seen it in your life, even though you consciously know with absolute certainty that you have been there many times and know it intimately. This is jamais vu, a French term meaning never seen, and it represents the inverse of the more commonly discussed déjà vu experience. While déjà vu gives us the unsettling sensation that we have encountered something before when we logically know we have not, jamais vu strips away our sense of familiarity from things we absolutely have experienced, creating a peculiar dissociation between our emotional and rational understanding of the world. The phenomenon typically lasts only seconds or minutes, during which a person might stare at their own bedroom or look at a cherished photograph and feel genuine confusion about what they are observing, as if they have stepped into someone else's life or entered a parallel version of reality where nothing belongs to them. Neuroscientists believe that jamais vu occurs due to temporary disruption in the brain's memory retrieval systems, where the neural pathways responsible for accessing our autobiographical memories or semantic knowledge become momentarily disconnected from our conscious awareness. It may be related to a brief glitch in the medial temporal lobe or prefrontal cortex, the regions responsible for memory consolidation and the sense of familiarity that normally accompanies recognition. This disconnect between the rational knowledge stored in our brains and the emotional resonance we expect to feel creates a jarring cognitive dissonance that can feel almost surreal. Yet despite understanding these mechanisms, despite knowing rationally that this feeling will pass and that the familiar will become familiar once again, we remain oddly vulnerable to this experience. And consider the peculiar experience of knowing something with absolute certainty, yet being completely unable to retrieve it from your mind at the precise moment you need it most. You find yourself in conversation, searching desperately for a word that sits just beyond your conscious grasp, frustratingly close yet impossibly distant. The word exists in your memory, you know its meaning, you can almost feel its shape on your tongue, yet when you try to grasp it directly, it dissolves like smoke. This phenomenon, commonly called being on the tip of your tongue, represents one of the mind's most maddening paradoxes. The information you seek is unquestionably stored within your brain, accessible enough that you can sense its presence and even recognize it immediately when someone else mentions it, yet your conscious retrieval mechanism fails you entirely. From a neurological perspective, the tip-of-tongue state occurs when the semantic knowledge of a word, its meaning and context, becomes activated in your memory, but the phonological representation, the actual sounds that comprise the word, remains inaccessible. Different neural pathways are involved in storing meaning versus storing the sounds and letters of language, and sometimes these pathways fail to synchronize properly during retrieval. Yet what makes this truly paradoxical is that we experience this phenomenon as an absolute certainty of knowing, combined with an absolute inability to demonstrate that knowledge. You cannot produce the word, cannot write it down, cannot do anything with it except feel its hovering presence. What emerges from this state is a peculiar form of unconscious certainty that coexists alongside conscious failure, reminding us that knowing and being able to access what we know are entirely separate neurological processes. Consider the peculiar fact that most people cannot remember anything from their earliest years, despite those years being filled with vivid experiences, intense emotions, and formative moments that supposedly shaped the entire trajectory of their lives. You have no memory of learning to walk, no recollection of your first words, no mental snapshot of your parents' faces from when you were 2 years old, yet psychological theory insists that these forgotten years are profoundly important to your development and personality. This phenomenon, known as childhood amnesia, represents a strange disconnect between the theoretical significance we assign to early childhood and the absolute emptiness of our autobiographical memory from that period. Most people cannot recall anything before approximately age 3 or 4, with memories remaining sparse and fragmentary until around age 7 or 8. Yet we spend years in therapy exploring the supposed formative impact of those very years we cannot remember. The mechanism behind this paradox appears rooted in neurodevelopment, as the hippocampus, the brain structure responsible for encoding long-term memories, does not fully mature until around age 3, and the prefrontal cortex necessary for autobiographical narrative formation develops much more slowly. Additionally, young children lack the linguistic framework and conceptual schemas necessary to encode experiences as coherent memories that can be retrieved later. Yet here lies the profound psychological contradiction. We treat early childhood as crucially important while simultaneously having zero direct access to it, forcing us to rely entirely on external narratives, family stories, and retrospective interpretation to understand who we are. We have fundamentally normalized this paradox, accepting without question that the most supposedly formative period of human development remains completely inaccessible to conscious memory, creating an odd sit. Consider how easily you can recall events from your teenage years and early 20s, how vivid and numerous those memories seem compared to other periods of your life. How a song from that era can transport you instantly back to a specific moment with almost photographic clarity, while years from your 30s or 40s blur together into an indistinct haze of routine and repetition. This phenomenon is called the reminiscence bump, and it reveals something peculiar about how your memory actually works and how your sense of self becomes crystallized during specific windows of time. The reminiscence bump typically peaks around ages 15 to 25, when memories become disproportionately vivid and accessible compared to memories formed before or after this period, creating an asymmetrical distribution of your personal history that bears little relationship to when events actually occurred or their objective importance. The psychological mechanism underlying this effect involves multiple converging factors working simultaneously, beginning with the cognitive changes occurring during adolescence and young adulthood, when your brain is still developing its capacity for complex encoding and emotional processing, combined with the reality that this period tends to be filled with novelty and first experiences that naturally receive greater attention and deeper processing than routine later events. During your teenage years and early 20s, you encounter many situations for the first time, whether romantic relationships, independent decision-making, or identity formation, and novel experiences are encoded more robustly into memory because they require more cognitive resources and generate stronger emotional responses than familiar, repeated events. Consider a time when you experienced something deeply painful or emotionally intense, perhaps a conflict with someone you cared about, a moment of profound embarrassment, or a significant loss that seemed at the time as though it would haunt you forever. Yet as the months and years pass, you find that while you can still recall the event itself with reasonable clarity, the emotional sting has diminished substantially, as though the sharp edges of that pain have been worn smooth by time itself. This is the fading affect bias, a curious phenomenon wherein the emotional intensity associated with our memories deteriorates at a faster rate than our ability to recall the factual details of what actually occurred. You remember that something bad happened, and you might even retain accurate information about what that thing was, but the terrible feeling that accompanied it has somehow slipped away into the recesses of your mind. The mechanism behind this bias appears to involve the way our brain catalogs emotional experiences differently from neutral ones, as if our minds possess a kind of natural emotional erosion that continuously softens the effective charge of our memories while leaving the structural framework relatively intact. Our brains seem to prioritize the preservation of information over the preservation of feeling, allowing us to maintain factual knowledge about our past while being somehow protected from having to relive the emotional devastation repeatedly throughout our lives. Yet despite this being a fundamentally protective mechanism that allows us to move forward without being perpetually anchored to our suffering, we have developed an unusual relationship with this bias, often feeling oddly guilty or betrayed when we realize that a tragic or painful memory no longer hurts as much as it once did, as though the fading of affect somehow diminishes the significance of what occurred or suggests we did not care deeply enough in the first. Consider a memory from years ago that you revisit often in your mind, perhaps a vacation or a difficult period in your life that you have since survived. When you recall this experience, the memory feels warmer, more pleasant, and more meaningful than the actual lived experience probably was. The tedious moments fade into the background, while the few genuine highlights become the primary focus of your recollection. If you could somehow transport yourself back to that exact moment in time, you might be surprised to discover that you were actually anxious, bored, or uncomfortable in ways your present memory has completely erased. You remember the sunset on the beach, but not the sunburn or the argument with your travel companion. You recall the significance of overcoming a hardship, but forget the relentless anxiety that plagued you each day as you went through it. This phenomenon is called Rosy retrospection, the tendency to rate past events more positively in memory than we actually experienced them in the moment. The mechanism underlying this bias appears to be multifaceted in its operation. our brains naturally prioritize emotional resolution over emotional intensity, meaning that once a difficult period ends, our focus shifts to how we feel now rather than how we felt then. Additionally, we tend to edit our memories over time, unconsciously emphasizing information that aligns with our current identity and values while discarding details that contradict our present self-image. Time itself acts as a softening filter, gradually blunting the sharp edges of negative emotions while allowing positive emotions to crystallize into permanent fixtures of our personal narrative. What remains peculiar is how thoroughly we believe in these reconstructed memories, despite knowing intellectually that memory is fallible. Consider the moment you first heard about a major historical event, perhaps a tragedy or shocking news that seemed to freeze time itself in your mind. You can recall exactly where you were standing, what you were wearing, who told you the news, even the quality of light in the room at that precise moment. These vivid, crystalline memories feel absolutely certain, etched into your consciousness with photographic clarity, as though your brain captured everything in perfect detail like a camera flash illuminating a dark scene. Yet here lies the paradox. Despite feeling more vivid and trustworthy than ordinary memories, flashbulb memories are actually no more accurate than regular memories, and in many cases they are far less reliable. The intense emotional arousal and physiological stress response that accompany shocking events do create stronger encoding in memory, yes, but this emotional intensity does not actually protect these memories from distortion, contamination, or outright fabrication. Researchers have repeatedly demonstrated that people confidently misremember details about flashbulb memories with the same frequency as any other memory, sometimes even more frequently, yet the vividness of the recollection persists unchanged. What appears to happen is that the emotional salience of the event creates such a powerful sense of confidence and clarity that we mistake the intensity of the feeling for accuracy of the content. We confuse how well we remember the emotion of that moment with how accurately we remember the facts of that moment. Over time, these memories are subtly reshaped by subsequent conversations, media coverage, and our own reconstructive processes, yet they retain their characteristic sense of absolute certainty. The paradox deepens when we recognize that despite decades of scientific evidence showing flashbulb memories are unreliable, we continue to place tremendous trust in them, continue to use them as anchors for. Imagine sitting in a coffee shop and suddenly you recall a brilliant joke that makes you laugh aloud, and you share it with the friend sitting across from you with complete confidence that you've just remembered something genuinely funny, only to have them tell you that you told them that exact same joke 3 weeks ago, word for word, with the same inflections and timing. Or consider the musician who composes what they believe is an entirely original melody, a creation born purely from their own imagination and artistic vision, only to later discover that the melody is nearly identical to a song they heard on the radio years ago while driving, a song they had completely forgotten about at the conscious level. Or think of the student who writes an essay and submits it proudly, only to be accused of plagiarism because entire passages match something they read in a book months earlier, passages they had no conscious intention to copy and genuinely believed were their own words. In all these scenarios, something remarkable and deeply peculiar has occurred within the human mind. The person is not deliberately lying or trying to deceive anyone. They are not pretending to have forgotten something they actually remember. Rather, they have genuinely and truly forgotten the original source of the information, the melody, or the words, yet the memory itself remains intact in their mind, preserved somewhere in the vast network of neural connections. This phenomenon is called cryptomnesia, a term derived from the Greek words for hidden and memory, and it reveals something profound about how human memory actually works. When we learn something, read something, or experience something, that information doesn't simply exist in a vacuum within our minds. It becomes woven into the fabric of our thoughts, our associations, and our creative processes. Imagine you are sitting in a coffee shop and a friend tells you an interesting story about a celebrity scandal, and you find the story fascinating and immediately believe it as truth. Days later, you confidently mention this story to another friend as if you had read it in a reputable news source, when in reality you only heard it as casual gossip from someone at a cafe whose name you cannot even remember. This is the essence of source monitoring error, a subtle but profound failure of human memory and attribution that occurs when your brain forgets where a piece of information actually came from. The mechanism behind this error is surprisingly straightforward, yet deeply revealing about how our minds organize knowledge. When we encounter information, our brains encode the content itself very efficiently, but the metadata about where that content originated becomes less stable over time. Your brain essentially files away the fact that a celebrity was involved in a scandal, while the tag indicating that this came from casual conversation gradually fades or becomes inaccessible. Later, when you try to recall that piece of information, your brain retrieves the content but must reconstruct its source based on plausibility and internal logic. If the information seems credible and fits with what you believe to be true, your mind may assign it a more authoritative source than it actually possessed, essentially confabulating the origin story of that knowledge. What makes source monitoring error particularly insidious is that it persists even when we are explicitly told it exists, and even when we actively try to avoid it. We have normalized this error so thoroughly that we rarely question where our beliefs actually come from, instead accepting the reconstructed narratives our brains provide as faithful records of reality. Imagine you witness a car accident on a street corner, and immediately afterward, someone asks you detailed questions about what you saw, but they slip in a false detail, mentioning that the traffic light was red when you clearly remember it being green. And then later, when you're asked again about the accident in a formal setting, you find yourself uncertain about the color of that light, perhaps even convinced it was red, despite your original clear memory of the green light that you witnessed firsthand. This is the misinformation effect, a phenomenon where exposure to incorrect information after an event can actually alter and overwrite your genuine memory of that original event, creating a false recollection that feels just as real and authentic as the true memory it has replaced. The mechanism behind this curious distortion operates through the reconstructive nature of human memory itself, which functions not like a video recorder that stores pristine copies of experiences, but rather like a narrative that we continuously rebuild and reinterpret each time we recall it. And when new information is introduced into our awareness after an event has occurred, our brain integrates this information into the existing memory trace, essentially overwriting or blending the original details with these newly suggested details, making it nearly impossible to distinguish what we actually experienced from what we were later told we experienced. What makes this effect particularly fascinating is how it persists even when we are explicitly warned that misinformation might be presented to us, and even when we have strong confidence in our original memories, because the effect operates largely outside our conscious awareness and control, functioning as an automatic process of memory reconstruction that we cannot simply choose to override through willpower or skepticism alone. Which reveals something profound about the malleable and social nature of human. Consider the experience of remembering an event from your childhood with perfect clarity. The color of the walls, the exact words spoken, the emotional weight of the moment, all preserved in your mind like a photograph taken decades ago. You share this memory with a family member who was present, only to discover that their recollection differs substantially from yours, or that the event itself never occurred in the way you remembered it, or perhaps never occurred at all. This is the paradox of false memory, where our minds construct detailed, convincing narratives about experiences that either never happened or happened very differently than we believe. The mechanism underlying false memory is deceptively simple yet profoundly complex, rooted in how human memory actually functions as a reconstructive process rather than a recording device. Each time we recall an event, our brain doesn't simply retrieve a stored file, but instead rebuilds the memory from scattered fragments, filling gaps with inferences, expectations, and information encountered after the original event occurred. During this reconstruction, our brains incorporate suggestions from others, details from photographs or stories we've heard, our current emotional state, and our existing beliefs about how the world works. The misinformation effect occurs when post-event information subtly alters our recollection of what actually happened, and the source confusion phenomenon allows us to forget where information came from while retaining the information itself, leaving us convinced we experienced something we merely heard about. What makes false memories particularly paradoxical is that they feel absolutely genuine and are often held with greater confidence than accurate memories, as the emotional intensity and internal consistency of the reconstructed narrative convinces us of its authenticity. Imagine a teacher who begins the school year with genuine passion for helping students discover the joy of reading, spending hours recommending books and discussing literature with authentic enthusiasm, yet by the middle of the year finds themselves reduced to simply assigning mandatory reading lists and administering standardized tests, watching as their intrinsic motivation to inspire young minds gradually disappears beneath layers of bureaucratic requirements and performance metrics. This is the crowding out effect in action, a psychological phenomenon where external motivations, incentives, or pressures gradually erode and replace our internal drives and authentic desires, leaving us with only the hollow shell of obligation. When we introduce extrinsic rewards or punishments into activities we once loved, something curious happens in our minds. We begin to reframe the activity itself as means to an end rather than as an end in itself, and over time, this reframing becomes so complete that we lose touch with whatever originally drew us to the activity. A parent who pays their child money for good grades might discover that the child stops studying for the genuine satisfaction of learning and instead focuses only on maximizing the payment. And if the payment ever ceases, so too does the studying, because the intrinsic motivation has been systematically crowded out by the external incentive. The mechanism operates through a kind of cognitive replacement process where our brain essentially decides that if an external reason exists to do something, the internal reasons become superfluous, and we begin to attribute our own behavior to these external factors rather than to our authentic desires. What makes this particularly insidious is how normalized and accepted this process has become in our modern institutions, where we assume that adding incentives and penalties will naturally increase desirable behaviors, rarely pausing to consider whether. Imagine a parent who deeply loves their child and wants to encourage them to pursue music, so they enroll the child in piano lessons, pay for a quality instrument, and arrange their schedule to ensure the child practices regularly. Yet something curious happens over time. The child, who once enjoyed playing piano spontaneously and with joy, begins to resist the lessons, practices only when forced, and eventually expresses a genuine desire to quit the very activity they once found delightful. The parent is puzzled and frustrated, unable to understand how their investment of money, time, and care could somehow diminish rather than enhance their child's intrinsic motivation. This phenomenon is the undermining effect, a psychological paradox in which external rewards or pressures, introduced with the best intentions, can actually erode our internal desire to engage in an activity we previously enjoyed. The mechanism at work involves a fundamental shift in how we perceive our own motivation. When an activity is initially pursued because it brings genuine pleasure or fulfillment, our brain attributes our engagement to internal factors. We do it because we love it, because it feels meaningful, because it expresses something authentic about who we are. However, when external rewards or controlling pressures are introduced, our mind begins to reattribute our behavior to those external factors instead. We start thinking we practice piano because we are required to, because our parents expect it, or because we want to earn praise, rather than because the music itself calls to us. Over time, this reframing of our own motivation actually weakens the original internal drive, leaving us dependent on the external incentive to maintain engagement. The paradox persists in countless modern contexts. Teachers who introduce grades into learning environments where students were previously self-directed, employers who implement surveillance systems to increase prod. Consider the peculiar situation in which a person decides they desperately need motivation to begin a task, yet the very act of seeking motivation becomes a substitute for actually starting the task itself. Someone struggling with a project might spend hours watching motivational videos, reading inspiring quotes, listening to podcasts about productivity, or scrolling through success stories of others, all while the original work remains untouched on their desk. They convince themselves that once they feel sufficiently motivated, once that internal spark ignites with enough intensity, then and only then will they possess the energy and drive to proceed. The paradox emerges from a fundamental misunderstanding of how motivation actually functions in the human psyche. We tend to believe that motivation precedes action, that we must feel inspired before we can act, yet the psychological reality operates almost entirely in reverse. Action generates motivation far more reliably than motivation generates action. Each small step completed, each minor progress achieved, each fragment of work finished produces a genuine sense of accomplishment and momentum that fuels further effort. The person who sits down and writes one paragraph experiences a small victory that naturally propels them toward writing another paragraph, whereas the person seeking the perfect motivational state may never reach a threshold high enough to justify beginning. What makes this paradox particularly resilient is that it feels intuitively true, this sense that we should wait until conditions are ideal and our internal states are perfectly aligned. We have normalized the idea that motivation is something that must be found or generated externally before we deserve to take action, rather than understanding it as a consequence of action itself. Imagine yourself sitting at a desk preparing for an important presentation, and you notice something peculiar about your own performance as your anxiety rises. Initially, as your stress levels climb from zero, your focus sharpens and your ability to recall information improves noticeably. Yet if that tension continues to mount beyond a certain threshold, your mind begins to fragment and your performance deteriorates rapidly, leaving you worse off than when you started with barely any pressure at all. And this inverted U-shaped relationship between arousal and performance has fascinated psychologists for over a century since its initial discovery. The Yerkes-Dodson law describes precisely this phenomenon, suggesting that performance increases with physiological arousal up to a critical point, after which additional stress becomes counterproductive and actively harmful to your cognitive function. Picture a student taking an exam who feels moderately anxious, which keeps them alert and motivated, their neurons firing efficiently as they work through problems with both caution and speed. But then imagine that same student whose worry escalates into panic, whose hands shake, whose mind races uncontrollably, and whose ability to think clearly vanishes entirely despite having studied the material thoroughly just hours before. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests on the relationship between arousal and cognitive resources. Moderate stress activates your sympathetic nervous system in ways that enhance attention and memory consolidation, narrowing your focus onto the task at hand while increasing motivation and energy levels. Yet excessive stress floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline to such degrees that your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for complex reasoning and executive function, becomes overwhelmed and essentially goes offline. Consider the peculiar situation of the accomplished musician who, after years of dedicated practice and refinement, becomes increasingly critical of their own performances, finding fault in subtle imperfections that the average listener would never perceive, while a beginner who has only recently picked up an instrument might play with unself-conscious confidence and genuine joy, entirely unaware of the technical limitations constraining their ability. This is the paradox of skill. The more competent you become in any domain, the more acutely aware you become of everything you cannot yet do, and simultaneously, the more discerning your ear becomes to the gap between your current performance and the ideal standard you now understand to exist. The beginner operates in a state of blessed ignorance, where the landscape of possible improvement remains largely invisible, and therefore their confidence is proportional to their actual ability rather than their perceived ability. But as you advance, your expanding knowledge creates an expanding awareness of complexity, nuance, and subtlety that you were previously too inexperienced to even recognize as existing. Your internal standard escalates faster than your actual performance can follow, creating a persistent sense of inadequacy that paradoxically emerges not from failure, but from success. The chess master sees infinite strategic depths in positions that would appear satisfactory to an intermediate player. The writer who has studied narrative structure becomes aware of hundreds of craft decisions they never considered before learning. And yet this phenomenon persists as a universal feature of skill development despite being entirely rational and expected, suggesting that somewhere deep within our psychology, we have normalized the experience of competence feeling like incompetence, and we have learned to accept that the price of genuine mastery is the permanent sensation of remaining an eternal. Consider the familiar scenario where someone picks up a musical instrument for the first time and produces an unexpectedly pleasant sound, or a novice golfer hits a perfect shot on their opening swing, or a person trying poker for the first time walks away with significant winnings, leaving everyone around them astounded and slightly envious. We have collectively named this phenomenon beginner's luck, and it occupies a peculiar space in our collective consciousness, sitting somewhere between genuine belief in mystical fortune and reluctant acknowledgement that it might simply be statistical coincidence dressed up in narrative clothing. The experience feels real enough in the moment, tangible enough to warrant discussion and explanation, yet slippery enough to evade any serious scientific scrutiny. When we examine what is actually happening beneath the surface of this persistent belief, we discover several intersecting psychological mechanisms working in concert to create the illusion of something extraordinary. First, there exists what psychologists call selection bias and survivorship bias, whereby we only remember and discuss the instances where beginners succeeded dramatically, while conveniently forgetting the countless occasions when newcomers failed miserably or performed exactly as poorly as statistics would predict. A beginner might attempt 1,000 actions with poor technique and terrible judgment, and we dismiss those as expected failures, but when that single attempt somehow succeeds against the odds, we transform it into a story, a moment of grace, a magical exception to the rules that govern everyone else. Additionally, beginners often possess a particular psychological state characterized by reduced anxiety and overthinking, because they lack the knowledge to understand what could go wrong or what the standard difficulties are supposed to be. And this sometimes translates into looseness, spontaneity, and freedom that paradoxically. Consider the surgeon who has performed a particular procedure thousands of times, whose hands move with perfect precision through muscle and tissue, yet who cannot explain to a medical student why each step matters or how it connects to the broader principles of anatomy. Consider the chess grandmaster who can defeat opponents in simultaneous games played blindfolded, moving pieces with supernatural accuracy, yet struggles to articulate the strategic reasoning behind moves that seem to flow from pure intuition. Consider the master musician whose fingers find the correct notes with absolute certainty, whose interpretation of a complex composition draws audiences to tears, yet who cannot teach another person to play with the same depth because they cannot access the knowledge that guides their own hands. This is the expert blind spot, a paradox where mastery and explanation become inversely related, where the accumulation of skill creates a peculiar disconnection from conscious understanding. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon emerges from the transition between conscious and automatic processing that occurs during the acquisition of expertise. When we first learn a skill, we must think deliberately about each component, creating explicit, verifiable knowledge that we can articulate and examine. As we practice over months and years, these conscious processes become compressed and automated, pushed into the background of cognition where they operate with efficiency but without transparency. The knowledge transforms from declarative, something we can state and discuss, into procedural, something embedded in the neural pathways that govern action. The expert's brain has reorganized itself so thoroughly around the practice skill that the intermediate steps, the conscious reasoning, and the fundamental principles have essentially dissolved into the seamless performance itself. Imagine yourself in a meeting where you have made a significant mistake and you feel the weight of embarrassment settling into your chest like a heavy stone. You believe that everyone in the room can see your anxiety, that your nervousness is written across your face in letters so bold and unmistakable that no one could possibly miss it. You imagine that your colleagues are all noticing your flushed cheeks, your slightly trembling hands, the way your voice wavers when you speak. Yet when you later ask a friend who was present whether they noticed anything unusual about your behavior, they respond with genuine confusion, telling you that you seemed completely composed and professional throughout the entire encounter. This disconnect between what you believe others perceive and what they actually perceive is the illusion of transparency, a cognitive bias that causes us to systematically overestimate the degree to which our internal states, emotions, and thoughts are apparent to other people. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through a fundamental asymmetry in information access and attentional focus. You have complete and direct access to your own inner experience, your racing thoughts, your physical sensations, and your emotional responses, creating an internal landscape that feels vivid, immediate, and all-consuming. When you attempt to imagine how others see you, you begin from this rich internal model and assume that what feels so obvious and present to you must also be obvious and present to them. However, other people do not have access to your internal world, they only observe your external behavior, which typically communicates far less information than you imagine it does. Moreover, other people are preoccupied with their own internal experiences and concerns. They are not studying you with the intense focus and attention that you imagine they are, meaning your perceived transparency is largely invisible to the V. Imagine you are driving on the highway and another car cuts you off suddenly, forcing you to brake hard and creating a moment of genuine danger on the road. Your immediate thought is that the other driver is reckless, aggressive, or simply incompetent, perhaps distracted by their phone or simply not paying attention to the road around them. Now imagine the reverse scenario, where you yourself accidentally cut off another driver on that same highway, forcing them to brake suddenly. In this moment, your explanation for your own behavior is entirely different. You might think that you did not see them in your blind spot, or that the sun was in your eyes, or that you were changing lanes at an awkward moment, or perhaps that the road conditions made it difficult to judge distances accurately. You are not reckless or aggressive or incompetent in your own mind. You are simply a person who made an understandable mistake given the circumstances you were facing. This is defensive attribution, and it is one of the most pervasive and automatic processes that shapes how we interpret the actions of others and ourselves. Defensive attribution emerges from a fundamental human motivation to protect our self-image and maintain a positive sense of our own character and competence. When something negative happens to another person, we unconsciously distance ourselves from responsibility for similar negative outcomes by attributing their misfortune to their own stable character traits or personal failings. We assume that bad things happen to other people because of who they are, not because of the circumstances they happen to occupy. Conversely, when something negative happens to us, we instinctively attribute it to external circumstances beyond our control, preserving the integrity of our self-concept. Consider a scenario where someone experiences harm through no fault of their own, yet society instinctively searches for reasons why the victim must have contributed to their own suffering, and in doing so, we create a paradox that undermines our understanding of causality and responsibility. When a person is assaulted, we ask what they were wearing or where they chose to be, as though their clothing or location somehow shares responsibility for another person's violent choice. When someone falls ill from a disease, we examine their lifestyle for flaws that might justify their suffering, rather than simply acknowledging the random cruelty of circumstance. This psychological tendency emerges from a deep cognitive need to believe the world operates on predictable principles where bad things happen to people who somehow deserve them, because this belief grants us a comforting illusion of control over our own safety and well-being. If we can identify what the victim did wrong, then we can assure ourselves we would never make such a mistake and therefore will never find ourselves in similar circumstances. Yet this reasoning contains a fundamental contradiction, for in blaming the victim, we simultaneously acknowledge that their actions could have caused the harm, while also recognizing that many people take identical actions without experiencing such consequences, creating a logical impossibility that we somehow maintain without cognitive dissonance. The paradox deepens when we consider that victim blaming actually makes us less safe, because it directs our attention away from the actual causes of harm and toward irrelevant details about those harmed, yet we persist in this pattern across cultures and generations. We have normalized a system of thinking that punishes people twice, first through their victimization and second through our judgment, all while maintaining the false sense that we are being rational and protective. Consider a person who has experienced tremendous suffering through no fault of their own, perhaps someone who lost their home in a natural disaster or fell victim to random violence, and notice how often observers respond not with pure compassion, but with a subtle shift in blame, wondering aloud what the person might have done to invite such misfortune, or suggesting that somehow they must have deserved it in some way. Because in our deepest psychological structures we have constructed an invisible ledger where the universe is fundamentally fair and just outcomes are always proportional to merit and behavior and moral character. This is the just world hypothesis, a pervasive cognitive bias that operates so quietly in our minds that we rarely notice it shaping our judgments and interpretations of the world around us. The mechanism underlying this belief is rooted in our need for psychological safety and predictability, because if the world is truly random and cruel and indifferent to our virtue, then no amount of goodness can guarantee our protection, and this thought is so destabilizing to our sense of control that we unconsciously reject it in favor of a comforting fiction, where good things happen to good people and bad things are always, somehow, earned through wrongdoing or carelessness or moral failing. We see this reflected in how we judge others' circumstances, automatically assuming that poverty reflects poor choices, that illness results from unhealthy habits, that failure indicates insufficient effort, constructing narratives where justice was served rather than acknowledging the blind forces of chance and circumstance that actually govern so much of human experience. The paradox deepens when we realize that this belief persists even though we encounter countlessly obvious examples of its falsity every single day, and yet we continue to maintain it because abandoning it would require us to accept a fundamentally different and far. Imagine sitting across from a fortune teller or a therapist, receiving a detailed personality reading that feels remarkably accurate, as though they have truly understood the deepest parts of who you are, Yet when you later discover that this exact same reading was given to dozens of other people with virtually no modifications, you experience a peculiar dissonance between what you believed and what is actually true. This is the Forer effect, a psychological phenomenon where individuals assign high accuracy ratings to vague, general statements about their personality when those statements are presented as personalized interpretations created specifically for them. The mechanism underlying this curious tendency operates through several interconnected psychological processes that work together seamlessly and unconsciously. When we receive information that we believe has been tailored to us personally, we enter a state of heightened receptivity, actively searching through our memories and experiences to find confirmation of what we are being told, a process known as confirmation bias. Our minds naturally tend to seek out evidence that supports what we expect to find while overlooking or dismissively categorizing information that contradicts our expectations. Additionally, we are far more likely to accept vague statements as meaningful and profound precisely because their ambiguity allows us to project our own experiences and interpretations onto them, filling in the blanks with our own psychological content. We feel clever when we recognize ourselves in a general description, attributing this recognition to the perceptiveness of the reading rather than to our own imaginative participation in the process. The statements themselves are typically crafted to be broadly applicable to most people, using phrases that reference universal human experiences and common personality traits, yet we convince ourselves that they describe our unique and individual self. Imagine you are sitting in a meeting at work, and a colleague presents an idea that is genuinely creative and well-researched, yet you find yourself dismissing it almost immediately, not because the idea itself is flawed, but because you have previously observed this colleague make several public mistakes or hold unpopular opinions on unrelated matters. This tendency to allow one negative characteristic or past failure to color your perception of everything else that person does or says is the horn effect, a cognitive bias that operates as the inverse of the more commonly discussed halo effect. Where the halo effect causes us to assume that someone who is good at one thing must be good at everything, the horn effect causes us to assume that someone who has failed at one thing or possesses one undesirable quality must be deficient across all domains of their competence and character. The mechanism underlying this bias is rooted in how our brains process information and conserve cognitive energy. Rather than evaluating each piece of information, each idea, or each behavior independently and on its own merits, our minds tend to create categorical shortcuts and generalizations based on limited data points. Once we have assigned someone a negative label or observed them stumble in one area, our brains create a mental file that becomes difficult to update, and we unconsciously filter all subsequent information through this established lens. When we encounter new ideas from this person, we are less likely to give them genuine consideration. When we observe their successes, we are more likely to attribute them to luck or external circumstances rather than skill. When they make mistakes, we are quick to confirm our pre-existing negative beliefs about them. What makes this paradox particularly persistent and insidious is that it operates largely outside our conscious awareness, and we have normalized it so thoroughly in our social and professional hierarchies. Imagine you are at a dinner party where the host reads aloud a shopping list of 20 items, speaking each one clearly with a pause between them, and afterward asks you to recall as many as you can remember. Most people find themselves remembering the first few items with surprising clarity, then struggling through the middle ones, then suddenly remembering the last few items again with unexpected ease. This phenomenon, where the beginning and ending items are recalled far better than those in the middle, reveals something peculiar about how memory organizes itself, and it happens so consistently that psychologists have divided it into two distinct components: the primacy effect, which favors the items presented first, and the recency effect, which favors those presented last. The mechanism behind this divided attention appears to operate through different neural pathways and encoding processes. The initial items receive more cognitive resources and rehearsal time because they are novel and undistracted by subsequent information, allowing them to transfer more readily into long-term memory storage. The final items, meanwhile, remain fresher in working memory, still residing in immediate conscious awareness, making them easily accessible for recall before they fade. The middle items, by contrast, are neither firmly established in long-term memory nor still present in working memory, leaving them orphaned between two systems. What makes this paradox particularly interesting is that we seem to know this should happen, yet we continue to be surprised by it each time, and we rarely adjust our strategies to compensate for this known weakness. We still present important information in the middle of speeches and documents. We still organize complex instructions in ways that bury crucial details, and we still assume our memory will treat all items equally despite overwhelming evidence that it will not. Imagine you're meeting someone for the first time at a social gathering, and within the first few moments of conversation, they make a somewhat awkward joke that falls flat, or they stumble over their words in a way that seems a bit clumsy and unprepared. Throughout the rest of the evening, as this person demonstrates genuine wit, thoughtfulness, and considerable charm, you find yourself still holding onto that initial impression, still somewhat skeptical of their abilities, still waiting for evidence that contradicts your first judgment. Weeks later, you might describe this person to a friend with that opening impression still somehow coloring your entire description, even though you've accumulated far more recent and positive evidence of their character. This tendency, where the information you encounter first disproportionately influences your overall judgment and shapes how you interpret everything that comes afterward, is what psychologists call the primacy effect. It occurs because our brains use early information as an anchor point, a foundational framework through which all subsequent information is filtered and understood. When new evidence arrives, rather than updating our judgment completely, we tend to adjust our view only slightly, using the initial impression as a kind of gravitational center that everything else must orbit around. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon relates to how memory and attention work together in the human mind. Early information receives more cognitive resources, more rehearsal, more integration into our existing belief systems, and consequently becomes more deeply encoded and more resistant to change. Additionally, once we've formed an initial judgment, we unconsciously begin to seek out information that confirms it while downplaying or reinterpreting information that challenges it, a process known as confirmation bias that reinforces and perpetuates our first impressions. Consider a student who has spent an entire semester performing consistently well, receiving solid marks on assignments and participating thoughtfully in class discussions, yet on the final examination, they perform poorly due to anxiety or fatigue on that particular day. When the professor reflects on this student's performance, they often find themselves disproportionately influenced by that final exam result, allowing it to overshadow months of demonstrated competence and reliability. This tendency to give greater weight to recent events when forming judgments and memories is what psychologists call recency bias, and it operates quietly within nearly every decision we make about people, situations, and ourselves. The mechanism underlying this bias is rooted in how our memory systems have evolved to prioritize accessibility and relevance. Recent experiences are still vivid in our working memory, requiring minimal cognitive effort to recall and contemplate, whereas older memories have faded into long-term storage and require active retrieval. Our brain, operating under the assumption that what is most recent is most relevant to current circumstances, naturally directs our attention toward these readily available mental representations. When we judge a friend's character based on a recent disagreement rather than years of loyalty, or when we evaluate a company's reliability based on their latest customer service interaction rather than their overall track record, we are systematically distorting our understanding of reality in favor of what simply feels most present. This bias persists despite our conscious awareness of its illogic, because the feeling of recency creates an illusion of importance that our rational mind struggles to override. We have normalized this pattern of thinking so thoroughly that we rarely question whether the most recent event truly deserves the disproportionate influence it wields over our conclusions. Imagine sitting in a coffee shop when a friend begins telling you about a dramatic argument they had with their partner, and just as they reach the crucial moment where everything fell apart, they pause and say they need to use the restroom, leaving you suspended in anticipation with the story unfinished. Hours later, long after the conversation has ended and your friend has provided no resolution whatsoever, you find yourself still thinking about that incomplete narrative, replaying the fragments they shared and constructing imaginary conclusions that never actually occurred. This is the Zeigarnik effect in its purest form, a psychological phenomenon first documented by Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s, wherein our minds demonstrate a remarkable tendency to retain and remain preoccupied with incomplete or interrupted tasks far more readily than with completed ones. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through a tension that builds within our cognitive system when we engage with something that lacks closure, a psychological incompleteness that creates what researchers describe as an intrinsic motivation to resolve the open loop in our minds. Our brains are fundamentally pattern completion devices, organized to seek resolution and establish coherence, and when a narrative or task remains unfinished, this natural drive toward completion creates an almost irresistible compulsion to keep the information active in our working memory, cycling through it repeatedly in search of an ending that never arrives. Despite understanding logically that an incomplete story shared by a friend holds no real consequence for our survival or well-being, despite knowing intellectually that thinking about it further will not provide us with the missing information we crave, we continue to ruminate and remember with striking intensity, our minds apparently unwilling or unable to simply set the matter aside into the category of forgot. Imagine you're sitting in a coffee shop and the ambient music shifts from upbeat pop to classical piano, and suddenly you find yourself thinking about sophistication, intelligence, and perhaps even feeling a subtle urge to order something more refined than usual, even though nothing about the coffee itself has changed. This is the priming effect at work, a phenomenon where exposure to one stimulus unconsciously influences your response to a subsequent stimulus, shaping your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in ways you never consciously registered or agreed to. A researcher might show participants a series of words related to elderly people like wrinkled, retired, and wisdom, and then measure how quickly they walk down a hallway afterward, finding that those primed with age-related words walk noticeably slower than a control group, despite having no conscious awareness that the word list had anything to do with their gait. The mechanism behind priming rests on the interconnected networks of associations in your brain, where concepts, emotions, and behavioral patterns are not stored in isolation, but rather linked together through countless invisible threads of memory and meaning. When you encounter a prime, whether it's a word, an image, a smell, or a social cue, it activates related concepts in your semantic network, making those ideas more mentally accessible and therefore more likely to influence your subsequent judgments and actions, all occurring beneath the threshold of your conscious awareness. What makes priming so philosophically unsettling is that it reveals how much of what feels like deliberate choice is actually the result of environmental manipulation happening in the shadows of your mind. Yet despite decades of research demonstrating this effect across countless domains, we continue to behave as though we are rational agents making free decisions, unaware of how a restaurant's dim lighting or a colleague's aggressive word choic. Imagine you are reading a restaurant menu on a quiet Tuesday evening, and you notice that a particular dish costs $28, which seems reasonable to you given the ambience and quality of the establishment. The same dish, however, prepared by the identical chef using the identical ingredients, would seem outrageously expensive if you encountered it on a food truck parked on the street corner during lunch hour. The price has not changed, the recipe has not changed, and the nutritional value remains constant, yet your perception of its worth shifts dramatically based entirely on the surrounding environment and circumstances. This is the context effect, a fundamental principle of human perception that demonstrates how our brains do not evaluate things in isolation, but rather construct their meaning through comparison with everything around them. When you see a moderately bright light in a dark room, it appears brilliant and almost blinding to your eyes, but that same light in broad daylight becomes nearly imperceptible, virtually invisible to your conscious awareness. The light itself produces identical photons and the same objective luminescence, yet the neural response in your visual cortex is entirely different depending on what surrounds it. Our judgments about colors, sizes, weights, loudness, intelligence, and attractiveness all operate according to this same principle, where the baseline established by our surroundings becomes the anchor point from which all new information is interpreted. This occurs because our sensory systems evolved not to measure absolute values, but rather to detect changes and contrasts, which are far more useful for survival than precise calibration. A predator that notices the slight movement of a branch in the forest has a better chance of survival than one that measures absolute reflectance values. Imagine you are shopping for a new apartment, and you've spent the entire morning viewing cramped, dimly lit, poorly maintained units with outdated fixtures and minimal natural light, each one more disappointing than the last, and then your real estate agent shows you a moderately priced, average apartment with standard amenities and ordinary decor. Yet suddenly this unremarkable space feels absolutely wonderful, spacious, and desirable simply because of what came before it. This is the contrast effect in action, a psychological phenomenon where our perception of something is dramatically shifted based on what we've recently experienced rather than on the absolute qualities of the thing itself. The apartment didn't change, but your experience of it transformed entirely because your brain compared it to the poor options you'd just seen, making the merely adequate seem genuinely appealing. This same mechanism occurs when you taste a sweet dessert after eating something bitter, when a moderately attractive person seems far more attractive after you've been surrounded by unattractive individuals, or when a salary that would have seemed insufficient suddenly feels generous after you've heard about much lower offers from competing companies. The contrast effect reveals how our minds don't evaluate things in isolation, but rather position them on a spectrum defined by our recent context, and this context becomes the invisible ruler measuring everything against an arbitrary standard. What makes this particularly fascinating is that we rarely pause to question whether our perception reflects reality or merely reflects the accidents of sequential comparison. Yet this bias persists even when we're fully aware of its existence, suggesting that our evaluative systems are fundamentally relational rather than absolute, forever anchored to the immediate past rather than operating from some objective measuring standard. Consider the experience of moving into a new apartment that you found absolutely beautiful when you first signed the lease. A space that filled you with genuine joy and appreciation as you walked through the door on moving day. Yet within mere weeks or months, that same apartment becomes simply the backdrop of your life, no longer remarkable or particularly pleasurable, as if your mind has recalibrated its expectations and reset its baseline for what constitutes acceptable living conditions. This phenomenon extends into nearly every domain of human experience, from the luxury car that loses its luster after the first few months of ownership, despite its objective qualities remaining unchanged, to the salary increase that brings temporary happiness before settling into a new neutral state, to the beautiful partner who once seemed extraordinary but gradually becomes simply the person you live with. Adaptation level theory suggests that we do not experience the world in absolute terms, but rather in relative terms, constantly adjusting our psychological baseline or reference point based on our recent experiences and circumstances, so that what once seemed wonderful becomes merely adequate, and what once seemed inadequate becomes intolerable only if we fall below our newly calibrated expectations. The mechanism appears to operate as a survival adaptation, theoretically allowing us to notice new threats and opportunities by essentially ignoring the familiar and stable features of our environment, much like how you stop hearing the hum of an air conditioner even though the sound continues unchanged. Yet this same mechanism seems to condemn us to a hedonic treadmill where genuine satisfaction becomes elusive because our expectations perpetually rise to meet our circumstances. Consider the modern professional who works with tools designed to save time, yet finds themselves busier than ever before, with each efficiency gain simply expanding the scope of what is expected of them, until the original time saved becomes almost invisible beneath new layers of obligation and demand. The paradox of progress emerges from this fundamental observation. As we develop new technologies, systems, and methods to improve our lives and accomplish our goals more quickly, we do not actually gain the freedom we anticipated, but instead find ourselves racing faster on a treadmill that has itself accelerated. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in the way human psychology interprets improvement and capability. When we become more efficient at a task, our expectations and the expectations of others rise proportionally, so that a task that once took 8 hours, now requiring 4, does not grant us 4 hours of rest or leisure, but rather fills that space with additional tasks, standards, or objectives that would have been considered impossible before the efficiency gain. We see this pattern everywhere. Smartphones were supposed to free us from the desk, yet we now carry our work everywhere and respond to messages at all hours. Washing machines were meant to liberate people from hours of manual labor, yet clothing consumption increased and cleanliness standards rose. Automobiles promised independence and adventure, yet created sprawling cities and hours of commuting. The psychological normalization of this paradox is perhaps the most insidious aspect, because we have collectively accepted that progress means perpetual acceleration rather than perpetual ease, and we interpret any moment of idleness or reduced obligation not as a gift, but as an opportunity to pursue further advancement, leaving us in a strange state where our tools do accomplish their stated purposes, yet deliver us precisely nowhere in terms of genuine freedom or peace. Imagine yourself working through a loyalty card at your favorite coffee shop, where each purchase brings you closer to a free drink, and you notice something curious happening as you approach completion. Your visits become more frequent, your sense of urgency intensifies, and you find yourself thinking about that final stamp far more often than you did when the card was nearly empty. This phenomenon reveals itself across countless domains of human behavior, from students who procrastinate through the semester yet suddenly become remarkably productive as the deadline approaches, to runners who maintain a steady pace for miles but suddenly find unexpected reserves of speed as they near the finish line. The goal gradient hypothesis, first formally documented by psychologists studying animal behavior in laboratory settings, describes our seemingly universal tendency to accelerate our effort and increase our intensity as we draw closer to completing a goal or reaching a desired endpoint. The mechanism underlying this pattern operates through a combination of psychological forces that work in concert to reshape our motivation and behavior. As the distance between our current position and our objective shrinks, the goal becomes more cognitively salient and psychologically real, moving from an abstract future aspiration into something tangible and achievable, which triggers increased dopamine responses in our brains and strengthens our commitment to action. Additionally, the progress already invested creates what psychologists call a sunk cost effect, where the portion of the journey already completed feels too valuable to abandon, pushing us to accelerate toward completion rather than maintain consistency throughout. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is how thoroughly it persists despite its inherent illogic. If our ultimate goal is to complete the task, the most efficient strategy would be to maintain steady effort throughout. Imagine a person who has just completed a vigorous workout at the gymnasium, feeling accomplished and virtuous about their commitment to physical health, and then later that same evening, they find themselves consuming a large dessert or several alcoholic beverages without hesitation, feeling somehow justified in this indulgence because of their earlier exercise. Or consider the individual who donates money to a charitable organization and then subsequently makes a purchase they would normally consider frivolous, experiencing no guilt whatsoever because they have already demonstrated their moral character through their charitable act. This phenomenon is called the licensing effect, and it represents a peculiar negotiation our minds make with our own values and intentions. The mechanism operates through a process of moral accounting, wherein our brains treat positive actions as if they accumulate credit in an internal ledger that can later be spent on behaviors we might otherwise restrict or feel guilty about engaging in. When we perform an action aligned with our values or our sense of self-image, we experience a psychological sense of licensing that permits us to deviate from those same values in subsequent moments. This occurs because our minds unconsciously calculate that we have already established sufficient evidence of being a good person, being health-conscious, or being environmentally aware, and therefore one small transgression will not meaningfully alter our overall self-perception or moral standing. The paradox deepens when we recognize that this accounting system operates entirely independent of actual impact or logical consequence. A single donation does not erase the environmental harm caused by a subsequently purchased fast fashion item, just as one workout does not metabolically offset the calories consumed in evening desserts, yet our psychological systems treat them as if they do. Imagine you have committed yourself to a strict diet, carefully tracking every calorie and maintaining discipline through each day. But then one evening you find yourself at a social gathering where you consume a single slice of cake, breaking your dietary rules in a moment of weakness. Rather than treating this as an isolated incident and returning to your disciplined approach the following day, you instead experience a peculiar psychological shift where you think to yourself, "What the hell?" and proceed to abandon your dietary restrictions entirely for the remainder of the evening, and perhaps for several days afterward. This is the what the hell effect, a phenomenon wherein a single transgression against a personal goal or commitment causes you to completely abandon your efforts and engage in the very behavior you were attempting to avoid, as though the initial violation has somehow rendered all future attempts at restraint meaningless. The mechanism underlying this effect appears to stem from how we construct our sense of self-control and moral identity. When you view yourself as someone who is dieting, or abstaining from something, or pursuing a particular goal, you maintain a psychological boundary between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. The moment you cross that boundary, even slightly, your mind seems to experience a kind of identity crisis where the narrative you have constructed about yourself no longer holds true. Rather than viewing the transgression as a minor exception to your overall commitment, your brain reinterprets it as evidence that your previous identity was false, and therefore all the rules and restrictions that accompanied that identity become suddenly irrelevant. This creates a permission structure where you rationalize further transgressions as inevitable consequences of your fundamental nature. Imagine a person who donates $50 to a charitable organization on a Monday morning, feeling genuinely good about their contribution to society, and then later that same week, when faced with an opportunity to help a stranger carry groceries up a flight of stairs, they decide they are too tired and walk past without offering assistance. This is moral licensing in its most fundamental form, a psychological phenomenon where performing one virtuous action creates a psychological permission structure that allows us to subsequently engage in less ethical behavior without experiencing the typical guilt or self-condemnation that would normally follow. The mechanism operates through a peculiar accounting system in the human mind, one where good deeds function as a kind of moral currency that we unconsciously believe we can spend on future transgressions, as though we have made a deposit in an ethical bank account and can now safely make withdrawals. When we perform an action that aligns with our self-image as a good person, our brain doesn't simply register this as one isolated moment in time. Instead, it updates our internal narrative about who we are, and this shift in self-perception fundamentally alters how we subsequently behave. The person who has just made a donation might unconsciously think that they have already demonstrated their generosity and compassion, and therefore subsequent situations requiring effort or sacrifice feel less urgent because they have already proven themselves virtuous. What makes this phenomenon so psychologically curious is that the moral licensing effect operates almost entirely below conscious awareness, bypassing our rational faculties and functioning instead through these associative, emotional pathways that constitute our sense of identity. Consider the experience of someone who has just completed a demanding morning at work, where they navigated difficult conversations, made countless decisions, and maintained their composure through frustration and fatigue. By the afternoon, this same person finds themselves unable to resist the temptation of snacks they had resolved to avoid, or they abandon their exercise routine despite having committed to it just hours earlier. This phenomenon, where our capacity to exercise self-control seems to diminish as the day progresses, reveals a curious paradox at the heart of human psychology. The mechanism underlying this experience suggests that willpower operates somewhat like a finite resource that becomes depleted through use, a concept often referred to as ego depletion in psychological literature. Each act of self-control, whether resisting a desire, making a deliberate choice, or maintaining focus against distraction, appears to draw from the same underlying reservoir of mental energy, leaving less available for subsequent challenges that require discipline and restraint. Yet here lies the genuine paradox that makes this phenomenon so intriguing. Despite decades of research and mounting evidence that willpower depletion feels entirely real in our lived experience, questions persist about whether this depletion is truly a physical limitation of our mental resources, or perhaps a learned belief system that has become so deeply ingrained in our culture that we have collectively normalized the expectation of our own failure. We accept without question that after sufficient exertion of self-control, we will inevitably succumb to temptation, and this acceptance may itself create the very conditions under which depletion occurs, as if our minds respond to our own predictions of weakness by obligingly providing exactly that weakness we anticipated. Consider the person who sits down with the firm intention to exercise complete discipline over their choices, only to find that the very act of exerting such rigid control eventually depletes their mental resources and leads to impulsive behavior that contradicts their original goal, suggesting that the pursuit of perfect self-control actually undermines itself. In everyday life, we observe this phenomenon repeatedly. The individual who restricts their diet so severely that they eventually binge eat, the student who studies with such intense focus that they burn out and stop studying altogether, the professional who works with such rigid discipline that they eventually lose all motivation and productivity. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox involves what researchers call ego depletion, the idea that self-control operates as a limited resource that becomes exhausted through use, much like a muscle that fatigues after prolonged exertion. When we demand absolute restraint from ourselves, we consume our available willpower reserves, leaving us vulnerable and depleted, paradoxically more susceptible to the very impulses we sought to control. The person attempting flawless discipline discovers that their strict internal standards create mounting psychological tension that eventually seeks release, that their perfectionist framework invites failure because humans are not designed for perpetual restraint without recovery periods. What makes this paradox particularly striking is how we have normalized this self-defeating cycle, how we continue to prescribe increasingly extreme self-discipline as the solution to behavioral problems, never quite recognizing that we may be diagnosing the symptom while ignoring the underlying truth that sustainable behavioral change requires acceptance, flexibility, and permission for human limitation rather than relentless control. Imagine yourself in the afternoon, having just spent your morning making difficult decisions at work, resisting the temptation to check your phone during an important meeting, and carefully monitoring your words during a tense conversation with a colleague. And as the day progresses, you notice that your willpower seems to have evaporated entirely, that resistance to unhealthy snacks becomes impossible, that procrastination on your evening tasks feels suddenly insurmountable, and that your patience with minor frustrations has completely dissolved into irritability that surprises even yourself. This is the experience of ego depletion, a phenomenon where the psychological resources required for self-control and decision-making become gradually exhausted through repeated use, leaving you feeling mentally drained and less capable of exerting discipline in other areas of your life. The mechanism underlying this experience suggests that willpower operates somewhat like a muscle or a battery, drawing from a finite reservoir of mental energy that depletes with each act of self-regulation or conscious choice. Whether that choice involves resisting temptation, making important decisions, controlling your emotional responses, or maintaining focus on difficult tasks. When this resource becomes depleted, subsequent tasks requiring self-control become exponentially more difficult, not because you lack the desire to perform them, but because the underlying neurological and psychological capacity to execute controlled behavior has been temporarily diminished. What makes ego depletion such a compelling paradox is how thoroughly we have normalized and accepted this limitation, despite its profound implications for our daily lives. How we rarely acknowledge that our capacity for discipline fluctuates dramatically based on prior cognitive exertion. How we blame ourselves for weakness in the afternoon when the real culprit is the invisible exhaustion of mental resources. Imagine yourself standing in a grocery store on a Tuesday evening after a full day of work, and you find yourself paralyzed in the cereal aisle, unable to decide between two nearly identical boxes of oatmeal, each with its own subtle claims about health benefits and taste preferences that suddenly feel impossibly important. You have already made hundreds of decisions today before arriving at this moment. What to wear, which emails to answer first, whether to attend a meeting or send a colleague instead, what to eat for lunch, how to respond to criticism, which projects to prioritize, and countless smaller choices that seemed inconsequential at the time but accumulated throughout your day like invisible weights on your mental shoulders. This phenomenon is called decision fatigue, and it represents a measurable decline in the quality of your decisions as the sheer quantity of choices you must make increases, leaving you mentally depleted and increasingly likely to make poor choices or defer decisions altogether. The mechanism underlying this experience is rooted in the brain's limited cognitive resources. Every decision, no matter how small, requires mental energy and activates your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function and rational thinking. And as you make more decisions throughout the day, this resource becomes progressively depleted like a battery slowly losing its charge. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is that our brains treat every decision with roughly equal weight, whether you are choosing between career paths or between two brands of yogurt, which means that the cumulative effect of trivial choices can genuinely diminish your capacity to make important ones. And yet we continue to structure our lives and societies around an abundance of choice, assuming that more options and more autonomy will lead to greater satisfaction when the psychological reality suggests the opposite. Imagine yourself sitting at your desk with your phone buzzing beside you, your email inbox showing 237 unread messages, a news application displaying headlines updating every few seconds, and your browser open to 7 different tabs, each containing articles you told yourself you would read later, but likely never will. You feel an urgent compulsion to stay informed, to not miss anything important, to remain connected to the constant stream of information that defines modern existence. And yet the moment you try to absorb even a fraction of what is available, your mind begins to feel foggy and overwhelmed, your ability to focus deteriorates, and paradoxically you end up retaining very little of substance. This is information overload, and it exists at the intersection of abundance and scarcity, where having unlimited access to knowledge somehow makes us feel more ignorant than ever before. The psychological mechanism at work here reveals a fundamental limitation in human cognitive architecture. Our attention is a finite resource, our working memory can hold only a limited number of items at once, and our brain requires adequate processing time to convert information into genuine understanding and long-term retention. When the supply of available information exponentially exceeds our capacity to process it, we experience decision paralysis, decision fatigue, and a peculiar form of anxiety that stems not from lack of information, but from the terrifying abundance of it. What makes this paradox so psychologically compelling is that we have normalized this state despite every biological signal telling us it is harmful. We celebrate staying busy and informed as virtues. We wear our overwhelm like a badge of dedication. And we rarely pause to question whether consuming more information actually serves our well-being or our understanding of the world. Consider the modern consumer who walks into a supermarket containing 10,000 distinct products, each one carefully engineered to appeal to their specific desires and preferences. Yet this person often leaves feeling not satisfied but overwhelmed, sometimes even departing empty-handed despite genuine hunger or need. This individual returns home to a closet filled with clothing options for nearly every conceivable situation, yet regularly complains of having nothing to wear and experiences decision fatigue before even beginning their day. They possess access to virtually unlimited entertainment through streaming services, social media platforms, and digital libraries containing millions of hours of content, and yet they frequently report feeling bored, understimulated, or paradoxically more anxious about their choices than ever before. This is the paradox of abundance, wherein the expansion of available options and resources does not proportionally increase satisfaction or well-being, but instead generates psychological friction, ambiguity, and a persistent sense of incompleteness. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves the cognitive load required to evaluate infinite choices against our finite mental resources, and the way that abundance generates both heightened expectations and the paralyzing awareness of opportunity cost, meaning that selecting one option inherently means rejecting countless others, a loss that our minds register with surprising emotional intensity. Additionally, abundance creates a shifting baseline of normalcy, where yesterday's luxury becomes today's standard, becomes tomorrow's disappointment, a hedonic treadmill that ensures no amount of accumulation ever reaches true sufficiency. We have somehow normalized this condition despite its obvious logical contradiction, accepting without significant resistance the notion that more options inherently mean more happiness, when in fact the evidence consistently suggests. Imagine walking through a store and seeing a shelf of identical products, each one marked with a small sign that reads, "Only 3 left in stock," or "Limited time offer ends today." And suddenly that item feels more desirable, more urgent, more worth acquiring than it did mere moments before when you were simply browsing without intention. This is the scarcity principle at work, a powerful psychological mechanism that causes us to assign greater value to things precisely because their availability is limited or perceived to be diminishing. The mechanism operates through a deceptively simple logic. Our brains have evolved to respond to scarcity as a threat, because throughout human history, genuine scarcity of resources did pose real survival risks, and therefore anything that appears to be running out automatically triggers a sense of urgency and importance in our minds. When we encounter something rare or difficult to obtain, our neural pathways light up with the same warning signals that would have alerted our ancestors to grab food before it spoiled or claim shelter before nightfall. And this ancient survival instinct persists within us even when we are standing safely in a climate-controlled store with endless alternatives available. The paradox emerges when we consider that most manufactured scarcity has absolutely nothing to do with genuine limitation. Yet we respond to it with the same intensity as though it were a matter of real consequence, treating a limited edition product launch or a flash sale with the emotional weight of a life-or-death decision. We have become so thoroughly conditioned to interpret artificial scarcity signals as meaningful that we have normalized this psychological response entirely, allowing marketers and retailers to manipulate our decision-making processes with nothing more than the strategic placement of a simple sign or a countdown timer on a website. Imagine a child in a room filled with toys, surrounded by colorful blocks, stuffed animals, and games scattered across the floor, yet their attention becomes entirely fixated on the single toy that has been placed just out of reach behind a glass barrier, the one toy explicitly declared off-limits by their parent. The child will abandon every accessible pleasure in pursuit of this restricted object, driven by an almost magnetic compulsion that seems entirely disproportionate to the actual desirability of the item itself. This phenomenon, known as the forbidden fruit effect, demonstrates how restriction paradoxically increases desire, transforming mundane objects into objects of intense craving simply because they exist beyond the boundary of permission. The psychological mechanism underlying this effect operates through several interconnected pathways in human cognition and motivation. When something is restricted or forbidden, our mind automatically interprets this barrier as a signal of value, assuming that something protected must be worth protecting and therefore must possess qualities worth desiring. Additionally, restriction activates what psychologists call psychological reactance, a state in which we experience our freedom as threatened and respond by desiring the restricted option even more intensely as a way of reasserting our autonomy and control. The act of prohibition itself becomes a form of persuasion, paradoxically convincing us that we want something we might have otherwise ignored entirely. What makes this effect particularly fascinating is how it persists despite our intellectual awareness of its illogical nature, operating beneath the surface of our rational understanding, and continuing to influence our choices even when we consciously recognize the mechanism at work. Consider the parent who tells their reluctant child that they absolutely do not want them to clean their room, that the child should leave it messy and disorganized, all the while knowing full well that this statement will trigger the opposite response, that the child, driven by the fundamental human impulse to assert independence and reject authority, will march directly upstairs and begin organizing with fervent determination. Or think of the romantic partner who, seeking to encourage their significant other to pursue a difficult goal, strategically expresses doubt about their abilities, knowing that this manufactured skepticism will ignite a fierce determination to prove them wrong and succeed beyond all expectations. These situations represent a fascinating paradox in human psychology, where explicitly stating the opposite of what we actually desire somehow becomes the most effective pathway to achieving our genuine objectives. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through our deep-seated psychological resistance to perceived control and our overwhelming need to maintain a sense of personal autonomy and agency in our lives. When someone presents us with a direct command or expectation, particularly one we sense comes from external pressure rather than our own volition, we experience an automatic reactance, a motivational drive to reassert our freedom by doing precisely the opposite of what has been suggested to us. Yet what makes this phenomenon truly paradoxical is that we continue to fall prey to it even after we intellectually understand the mechanism at work, even after we recognize that we are being manipulated through our own predictable psychology. We know that reverse psychology is being employed, we consciously identify the manipulation, and yet we still find ourselves compelled to resist the stated position and move toward its opposite, as though our understanding of the trick somehow fails to diminish its power over. Imagine a person who spends their entire day doing exactly what they want to do, free from external constraints, obligations, or anyone telling them what to do, and yet they find themselves deeply unhappy, anxious, and paradoxically less fulfilled than when they had structure imposed upon them. This is the autonomy paradox, a peculiar psychological phenomenon wherein the unlimited freedom to choose becomes a source of genuine distress rather than liberation. The person who leaves their job to pursue complete autonomy discovers that unlimited choice leads not to joy, but to paralysis, decision fatigue, and a strange emptiness that freedom alone cannot fill. They realize that while they are now free to do anything, this very freedom has made them uncertain about what to do, and the weight of infinite possibility becomes heavier than the constraints they once resented. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through several interconnected psychological processes that together create this counterintuitive outcome. When we have external structure, rules, or obligations, our sense of agency becomes narrowly focused on specific domains, and within those constraints, we can feel genuine autonomy and satisfaction in our choices. However, when all constraints are removed, the human mind struggles to navigate infinite possibility without reference points or external scaffolding. We become paralyzed by the tyranny of choice, where every decision carries the full weight of personal responsibility and the potential for regret. Additionally, autonomy without meaningful external validation loses much of its psychological reward, as we are social creatures who derive significant satisfaction from having our choices recognized and valued by others, or constrained by systems we can meaningfully resist. Consider the peculiar tension that defines modern individualism, wherein we celebrate our uniqueness and independence while simultaneously conforming to increasingly standardized patterns of self-expression, all while believing ourselves to be authentically individual. We dress ourselves in clothes purchased from mass-produced inventory, curate our personal identities through algorithmically selected content, adopt the same rebellious aesthetics as millions of others, and present carefully filtered versions of our lives on platforms designed to quantify our individuality through likes and follows, all while maintaining the conviction that we are boldly breaking free from societal constraints. The mechanism underlying this paradox stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of how social belonging actually functions in the human psyche. We believe that individuality requires complete separation from collective norms, yet the human brain evolved within deeply social contexts where identity itself is fundamentally relational and comparative. We define ourselves not through absolute characteristics, but through differentiation from those around us, which means that true isolation from social reference points makes authentic self-concept impossible. And yet the ideology of individualism insists that any acknowledgement of social influence somehow taints or diminishes our sense of authentic selfhood. This paradox persists because we have constructed a cultural mythology around individualism that reframes conformity to individualistic ideals as genuine independence, allowing us to participate in the most thoroughly monitored and behaviorally predicted societies in human history while maintaining the subjective experience of freedom and authenticity. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that the very technologies and systems designed to predict and influence our behavior are marketed to us as tools of personal liberation and self-actual. Consider a moment when you find yourself in a group of people, all walking in the same direction down a street, all wearing similar styles of clothing, all laughing at the same joke even though you did not find it particularly amusing, and all nodding in agreement with an opinion that you privately suspect might be incorrect. The conformity paradox emerges from this peculiar human tendency to align ourselves with the behaviors, beliefs, and aesthetics of those around us, even when we possess information or instincts that suggest a different path might be more authentic or accurate. You know at some level of your consciousness that the group might be wrong, yet you conform anyway, and this creates a strange logical contradiction at the heart of how we navigate social existence. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox operates through several interconnected systems within our minds. We are fundamentally social creatures whose survival for thousands of years depended upon our ability to belong to groups, to read the subtle signals of acceptance and rejection, and to modulate our behavior accordingly. When we encounter a group consensus, our brains interpret this as valuable information about how to behave safely and successfully, triggering a cascade of neural responses that make conformity feel natural and appropriate, even when rational thought might suggest otherwise. We experience genuine discomfort when we deviate from group norms, a discomfort so profound that it often overrides our independent judgment. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is that most of us recognize this tendency in others while remaining largely blind to it in ourselves. We observe teenagers conforming to peer pressure and judge them harshly, yet we conform constantly to professional dress codes, social media aesthetics, and conversational conventions without recognizing these as manifestations of the same underlying impulse. Imagine a group of people gathered together to make a decision about whether to take a significant risk, perhaps investing money in a venture with uncertain returns or recommending a bold medical treatment with unpredictable outcomes. When these individuals discuss the matter privately, each person might express cautious views, weighing the potential losses against the gains with reasonable restraint. Yet when they come together as a group to reach a consensus, something curious happens, and the collective decision often becomes notably more daring and aggressive than any of the individual positions that were initially expressed. This phenomenon is what psychologists call the risky shift, and it represents a fundamental transformation in how groups approach uncertainty compared to how individuals approach it when alone. The mechanism behind this paradoxical behavior operates through several interconnected psychological processes that intensify within group settings. When people assemble to make decisions collectively, they experience what researchers describe as diffusion of responsibility, where the burden of potential failure becomes distributed across all group members rather than resting on individual shoulders, thereby reducing the psychological weight of negative consequences. Furthermore, group discussion often introduces social comparison dynamics, where individuals become motivated to present themselves in favorable ways relative to their peers. And since risk-taking is frequently associated with confidence, competence, and leadership in many cultural contexts, group members subtly compete to demonstrate these valued qualities by advocating for progressively bolder courses of action. As the discussion unfolds and certain members propose riskier options, others gradually shift their positions to align with what feels like the emerging group consensus, a process amplified by the tendency to value conformity and group harmony. Consider a situation where a group of people with similar political views gather together to discuss an issue they all care deeply about, and as the conversation unfolds over time, each member gradually adopts more extreme positions than they held before arriving at the meeting. This phenomenon, known as group polarization, reveals something peculiar about human psychology, that our beliefs tend to intensify and radicalize when we're surrounded by others who share our perspective. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through several interconnected psychological forces, beginning with what researchers call the comparison effect, where individuals discover that their views are perhaps less extreme than some of their peers, motivating them to shift further in that direction to maintain their sense of identity and status within the group. Simultaneously, the persuasive arguments effect takes hold, as group members expose each other to novel arguments and evidence they hadn't previously considered, arguments that happen to align with their existing worldview and thus strengthen their conviction. As each person becomes more committed to the extreme position, social pressure intensifies, making it increasingly difficult for anyone to voice doubts or dissenting perspectives without fear of social rejection. What makes this paradox so intellectually troubling is that the group has no formal pressure to become more extreme, no external authority forcing them toward radicalization, yet the very act of gathering and discussing among ideological allies propels them inexorably in that direction. We see this dynamic everywhere in modern society. Political echo chambers online amplify partisan divides, activist groups develop increasingly uncompromising platforms, and even scientific research communities can become locked into paradigms that resist alternative interpretations. Imagine yourself sitting in a meeting room with 9 colleagues, tasked with solving a complex problem that will determine whether your department receives additional funding for the year. And as the discussion unfolds, you notice something peculiar happening within yourself. A subtle diminishment of your effort, a quieting of your voice, a sense that surely someone else in this room will contribute the brilliant insight needed. And so you lean back slightly in your chair and allow the weight of responsibility to distribute itself across the group, rather than resting entirely upon your shoulders. This phenomenon, known as social loafing, describes the tendency of individuals to exert less effort when working as part of a group compared to when working alone, a counterintuitive behavior that seems to contradict our rational understanding of accountability and personal standards. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox operates through several interconnected pathways. First, there exists a diffusion of responsibility, where each individual in the group assumes that others will compensate for any shortfall in their own contribution, creating a mental calculation that their personal effort matters less because it represents only a fraction of the total output. Second, the anonymity that larger groups provide generates a reduced sense of personal accountability, since it becomes difficult to isolate and measure any single person's contribution. And third, individuals often engage in social comparison, monitoring their effort against perceived group norms and adjusting downward if they sense that others are not pushing themselves to maximum capacity. What renders this paradox particularly fascinating is that we possess complete intellectual awareness of its mechanics. We understand logically that if everyone in the group reasons this way, the collective output will suffer dramatically. And yet this knowledge rarely prevents the loafing from awk. Imagine a crowded public space where someone collapses on the ground, and dozens of people stand nearby, watching, waiting, hoping that someone else will step forward to help or call for emergency services. Yet no one does, and the person lies there as minutes pass, with every witness assuming that surely someone in this large crowd must be taking action already. This phenomenon, known as the diffusion of responsibility, reveals a peculiar truth about human psychology. The more people present in a situation, the less personal obligation any individual feels to intervene, as if responsibility itself becomes diluted across the group like water spreading across a surface, thinning with each additional person until it becomes nearly imperceptible. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests on several psychological foundations, including the assumption that in a large group, others have likely already taken action or are better positioned to help, combined with the anonymity that crowds provide, which reduces individual accountability and self-consciousness about inaction. Additionally, when surrounded by others who are themselves inactive, a person's own inaction becomes normalized and justified, creating a feedback loop where everyone's passivity reinforces everyone else's passivity. What makes this phenomenon particularly intriguing is how it persists despite being fundamentally irrational, because even when we intellectually understand that large groups should theoretically be more helpful rather than less helpful, we continue to experience this pull toward inaction in crowded environments. We have somehow normalized the idea that being one person among many absolves us of responsibility, that our individual agency dissolves into the collective presence, that the obligation to help becomes everyone's burden and therefore no one's burden, and we accept this logic so thoroughly that we rarely question it even as we witness its consequence. Imagine a conference room where 12 intelligent professionals sit around a table, and one person presents an idea that seems questionable, yet nobody speaks up to challenge it. Instead, each person looks around the room, sees others nodding in agreement, and assumes they must be missing something important. Within minutes, what began as a tentative suggestion has transformed into a collective decision that nobody actually believes in privately, yet everyone has committed to publicly. This is groupthink, a phenomenon where the desire for harmony and consensus within a group overrides realistic appraisal of alternative courses of action. The mechanism operates through several interconnected psychological forces. First, there is the pressure toward conformity, where individuals unconsciously suppress their own doubts and reservations because deviating from the group consensus feels socially risky. Second, there is the illusion of unanimity, where silence is interpreted as agreement, meaning that the quiet person who is actually uncertain is counted as a supporter. Third, there are self-appointed mind guards who actively discourage dissenting views, believing they are protecting group morale when they are actually preventing the group from accessing crucial information. The paradox deepens when we consider that groupthink is most common among highly cohesive, well-functioning groups rather than dysfunctional ones, because the bonds of trust and camaraderie create an environment where challenging others feels like betrayal. We have largely normalized this dynamic in organizational culture, treating it as an inevitable cost of teamwork rather than recognizing it as a systematic failure of collective reasoning that has led to countless disastrous decisions throughout history. Imagine a classroom where a teacher has been told by administrators that certain students are late bloomers or slow learners, labels that were completely arbitrary, assigned without any real assessment of their actual abilities. Over the course of months, something peculiar unfolds. The teacher unconsciously gives these students less attention during lessons, calls on them less frequently, provides them with less detailed feedback on their work, and generally holds them to lower expectations. The students, sensing the subtle shift in how they are regarded, begin to internalize these diminished expectations. They study less rigorously, raise their hands less often, and eventually their academic performance declines significantly. By the end of the year, the arbitrary labels have become self-fulfilling prophecies, and the students who were told they were slow learners now actually perform below their peers, despite having possessed equal potential months earlier. This phenomenon is known as the golem effect, the inverse of the famous Pygmalion effect, and it operates through a deceptively simple mechanism. When we hold low expectations of others, we communicate these expectations through countless subtle behavioral cues. Our tone of voice, our facial expressions, the amount of time we wait for an answer, the complexity of questions we ask, and the warmth of our interactions. These individuals internalize our low regard as truth about themselves, and their self-concept reshapes accordingly. Their motivation diminishes, their effort decreases, and their performance follows suit, confirming what was never true to begin with. What makes the golem effect particularly insidious is that it operates almost entirely below conscious awareness, both for the person holding low expectations and for the person receiving them. Imagine a teacher on the first day of school who receives a class roster, along with a note indicating that certain students are academic bloomers, children identified by a supposed test as having exceptional potential for intellectual growth during the year, when in reality these students were selected entirely at random and possess no actual advantage over their peers. By the end of that academic year, those randomly designated students show measurable increases in their IQ scores and academic performance compared to their classmates, not because they were genuinely more capable, but because the teacher's belief in their potential fundamentally altered how they were treated, how much attention they received, how they were questioned, and the quality of feedback provided to them. This phenomenon, named after the mythological sculptor who fell in love with his own creation and brought it to life through sheer force of belief, reveals something unsettling about human nature and the invisible architecture of expectation. The mechanism operates through a cascade of subtle behavioral shifts that accumulate over time into measurable differences in performance and self-perception. When we believe someone will succeed, we unconsciously lean forward during conversations, we ask them more challenging questions, we give them more time to answer before interrupting, we provide more specific and constructive feedback rather than generic praise, and we create more opportunities for them to demonstrate competence. These students receiving this elevated treatment begin to internalize the belief that they are indeed exceptional. They take more risks with their learning, they persist longer when facing difficulties, and they develop a stronger sense of academic identity. Imagine watching two people arrive late to an important meeting, and notice how your mind immediately constructs two entirely different explanations for the same behavior. When your colleague walks in 20 minutes behind schedule, you might think to yourself that they must have encountered unexpected traffic, or perhaps a family emergency demanded their attention, or maybe their previous meeting ran over in ways beyond their control. Yet when you yourself arrive late to that same meeting the following week, you know with absolute certainty that it was genuinely unavoidable, that circumstances conspired against you, that the situation was simply beyond your reasonable management. However, when your friend arrives late to dinner next week, you suspect they simply did not plan adequately, or perhaps they did not prioritize your time together highly enough, or they lack the organizational skills to manage their schedule properly. This fundamental asymmetry in how we explain the actions of others versus our own actions represents what psychologists call actor-observer bias, a pervasive distortion in how we attribute causality to human behavior that shapes our relationships, judgments, and daily interactions in profound ways. The mechanism underlying this bias stems from the different information available to actors and observers in any given situation. When you are the actor committing an action, your attention focuses predominantly on the external circumstances surrounding you, the environmental pressures, the situational constraints, the unexpected obstacles that emerge to shape your behavior. Your own perspective is naturally saturated with contextual awareness, and you are intimately acquainted with all the factors that influenced your choices. Imagine you're sitting in traffic on a morning when you're already running late, and the car ahead of you brakes suddenly without apparent reason, causing you to slam on your own brakes and nearly spill your coffee. In that moment of frustration, your mind immediately conjures a narrative. That driver is reckless, careless, probably not paying attention, maybe they're a bad driver in general. You construct an entire character assessment based on a single observation, attributing their behavior to something intrinsic about who they are as a person. But what you don't see is that just beyond your line of sight, there's a child's toy in the road, or an animal crossing, or they spotted a hazard you haven't reached yet. Their action wasn't about their character at all, it was entirely situational. Yet your mind, in its efficiency, skipped right past considering the circumstances and went straight to concluding something fundamental about their nature. This tendency, known as the fundamental attribution error, describes our pervasive human habit of overestimating the role of personality and character when explaining others' behavior while simultaneously underestimating the power of the situation surrounding them. When someone cuts us off in traffic, we assume they're aggressive. When a colleague misses a deadline, we believe they're irresponsible. When a stranger doesn't hold the door, we think they're rude. What makes this cognitive pattern particularly interesting is that we almost never apply it to ourselves. When we are late, we blame traffic. When we miss a deadline, we point to unexpected circumstances or competing demands. When we don't hold the door, we were distracted or didn't notice. Our own behavior, we instinctively understand, exists within a rich context of situational factors. Yet we rarely extend this same contextual generosity to others. Consider the moment when a project at work succeeds, and you find yourself immediately attributing that success to your own intelligence, hard work, and careful planning. While when that same project fails, you quickly blame external circumstances like insufficient resources, unclear instructions from management, or timing that was simply beyond your control. This pattern of thinking, where we systematically take credit for positive outcomes while deflecting responsibility for negative ones, represents one of the most pervasive and deeply ingrained psychological phenomena in human cognition. The self-serving bias operates so quietly within our minds that we rarely notice its presence, even as it shapes how we narrate our own lives to ourselves and to others. We encounter this bias everywhere in human behavior. The student who believes their exam success reflects their brilliance, but their failure reflects a poorly designed test. The employee who sees their promotion as recognition of their exceptional talent, but a colleague's promotion as pure luck or office politics. The driver who considers themselves above average in skill, while simultaneously viewing other drivers as dangerously incompetent. The mechanism underlying this bias appears to be fundamentally protective in nature, designed to maintain our self-esteem and sense of competence even when reality presents contradictory evidence. Our brains seem to construct narratives that preserve our positive self-image, filtering information in ways that emphasize information confirming our abilities while minimizing or reinterpreting information that might suggest limitation or failure. Yet despite understanding this bias intellectually, despite being able to observe it clearly in others and even occasionally in ourselves, we continue to operate under its influence throughout our lives. Imagine yourself walking into a furniture store and you see a sofa displayed with a price tag of $800 crossed out, with a new price of $499 written boldly beneath it. Your immediate sense of relief and excitement at finding such a remarkable bargain floods through you, and you feel compelled to purchase this item immediately, convinced that you are making an excellent financial decision. However, the truth underlying this scenario reveals something far more subtle about how your mind processes value and makes decisions. The original price of $800, the first number you encountered, becomes what psychologists call an anchor, a reference point that your brain uses to evaluate all subsequent information, even though this initial number may have been entirely arbitrary or disconnected from the item's actual worth. Your mind unconsciously accepts this first figure as a baseline, a standard against which all other prices are measured, and when the discounted price is presented immediately afterward, your brain calculates the difference and celebrates the savings without ever independently verifying whether either price was justified in the first place. This anchoring effect persists with remarkable consistency across countless domains of human decision-making, from salary negotiations, where the first offer sets the psychological tone for all counteroffers, to medical diagnoses, where the initial symptoms mentioned by a patient influence how a doctor interprets subsequent findings, to real estate markets, where recently sold comparable properties establish mental anchors that shape how buyers and sellers perceive fair market value. The mechanism operates largely outside of conscious awareness, relying on a cognitive shortcut that generally serves us well when we lack complete information, as our brains rightfully recognize that the first relevant number we encounter often does contain some. Imagine two hospitals presenting the exact same medical treatment option to a patient facing a serious illness. Yet one hospital describes it in terms of survival rates, while the other describes it in terms of mortality rates. And despite the mathematical equivalence of these presentations, the patient's willingness to accept the treatment shifts dramatically depending on which frame they receive. The framing effect demonstrates how our decision-making processes are not governed by objective reality alone, but rather by the particular linguistic and contextual packaging in which information arrives to our consciousness. and this realization becomes especially unsettling when we consider that the underlying facts have not changed whatsoever between these two presentations. When a treatment is described as having a 90% survival rate, most people feel hopeful and embrace the option readily. Yet when the same treatment is presented as having a 10% mortality rate, the psychological reaction intensifies toward caution and hesitation, even though these two statements contain identical information expressed through different linguistic lenses. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through our cognitive relationship with language and narrative framing, where our minds do not naturally process raw data in isolation, but instead construct meaning through the contextual stories and emotional associations that language provides. And positive frames activate associations with hope and possibility, while negative frames activate associations with loss and danger, thereby shaping our preferences before rational deliberation has truly begun. We have normalized this susceptibility to framing as simply part of human nature, accepting that our choices emerge from psychological tendencies rather than pure logic. Yet this acceptance obscures something profound about the nature of human judgment itself, for if our decisions can be so thoroughly. Consider the moment when you envision your future and find yourself believing that positive outcomes are more likely to happen to you than to others, despite having access to identical statistical information that should suggest otherwise. A person might believe they are less likely to experience divorce, illness, or financial hardship than their peers, even though they possess no special characteristics or circumstances that would protect them from these universal human vulnerabilities. They watch their friends and colleagues encounter misfortune and think to themselves that surely their own situation will be different, that they possess some invisible advantage or possess better judgment that will shield them from similar fates. This optimism bias operates as a systematic tendency of the human mind to anticipate more favorable outcomes than what objective probability would suggest, and it appears across cultures, demographics, and educational backgrounds with remarkable consistency. The mechanism behind this phenomenon involves several interacting psychological processes that work together to create and maintain this distorted perception of personal likelihood. Our brains naturally emphasize information that confirms what we already believe about ourselves while downplaying or dismissing evidence that contradicts our self-image, a process known as confirmation bias that feeds directly into optimism bias. We tend to attribute our successes to our own abilities and efforts while attributing our failures to external circumstances beyond our control, which creates an inflated sense of our own competence and control over future outcomes. Furthermore, we have access to fewer instances of our own misfortunes compared to the misfortunes we observe in others, leading us to unconsciously conclude that tragedy simply happens less frequently in our lives. Imagine yourself sitting in a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning, reading an article about a major historical event or a recent market crash, and you find yourself thinking with absolute certainty that the outcome was obvious all along, that anyone with basic intelligence could have predicted what happened, that the warning signs were glaring and unmissable to anyone paying attention. You might think to yourself that you would have seen it coming, that the decision-makers involved were foolish or incompetent for not recognizing what now seems like an inevitable conclusion. This experience, this sense that past events were more predictable than they actually were at the time they occurred, is the essence of hindsight bias, a cognitive distortion that affects nearly every human being regardless of intelligence or education. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in how our memories actually work and how our brains reconstruct narratives about the past. When we learn the actual outcome of an event, that information becomes integrated into our memory, and we unconsciously revise our recollection of what we thought before, adjusting our remembered probabilities and expectations to align with what we now know to be true. Our brains are extraordinarily efficient at creating coherent stories, and those stories naturally incorporate all available information, including information that only became available after the initial decision point. The neural pathways that encoded our original uncertainty and our original range of possible outcomes get overwritten by the certainty of the actual result, making it genuinely difficult for us to reconstruct what the world looked like before we knew how things turned out. What persists despite having no logical reason to do so is our continued judgment of others based on this distorted sense of what was knowable at the time, our tendency to blame decision-makers for not seeing the future, our harsh assessment. Imagine you have just learned about a plane crash that occurred somewhere across the world, and for the next several weeks, you find yourself feeling anxious about flying, despite knowing statistically that commercial aviation remains one of the safest forms of transportation available to us. You start noticing airplane accidents in news headlines more frequently than before, your mind readily retrieving examples of aviation disasters while simultaneously forgetting the millions of safe flights that occur each day without incident. This is the availability heuristic in action, a cognitive shortcut where your brain estimates the likelihood or frequency of events based on how easily examples come to mind rather than on actual statistical reality. The mechanism operates with deceptive simplicity. When information is vivid, recent, emotionally striking, or widely publicized, your mind treats it as more common and probable than it truly is, because those memorable instances flood your consciousness more readily than less dramatic occurrences that happen with far greater regularity but leave quieter impressions. You see stories about lottery winners and imagine your chances are better than they mathematically are because you can easily recall their triumphant faces, while the countless people who never win remain faceless and forgotten. News outlets amplify this tendency by reporting unusual events extensively, making kidnappings, murders, and accidents seem far more prevalent than the actual statistics would suggest. Yet your brain's availability heuristic causes you to weight these vivid examples more heavily than the boring truth of ordinary safety. What makes this cognitive pattern particularly fascinating is how it persists even when we consciously understand its mechanism, when we know logically that accessibility does not equal probability, yet still find ourselves unable to override the emotional weight that memorable examples carry. Imagine you own a coffee mug, a simple ceramic vessel with perhaps a faded design or a chip on the rim, something you've had sitting in your kitchen cabinet for months or even years without much thought. Now imagine a researcher offers to buy that mug from you, asking how much money you would need to part with it, and you find yourself saying $40, $50, perhaps more. Yet if that same researcher were to show you an identical mug in a store and ask how much you would pay to purchase it, you would likely say $10 or $15, maybe even walk away thinking the price too steep. This asymmetry in valuation, where the ownership of an object inflates its perceived worth in our minds, is known as the endowment effect, and it represents one of the most pervasive and peculiar features of human economic behavior. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to be rooted in the way our minds process ownership as an extension of ourselves, as though the object has absorbed something of our identity simply through our possession of it. When we own something, even temporarily, even something we did not choose and have no particular attachment to, our brains seem to integrate it into our sense of self, making the prospect of losing it feel like a personal diminishment rather than a simple transaction. This psychological anchoring creates what researchers call a loss aversion bias, where the pain of losing something registers more intensely than the pleasure of gaining an equivalent value. And because we already own the object, we experience relinquishing it as a loss rather than as a neutral exchange. What makes this effect particularly perplexing is that it persists even when we are fully aware of its illogical nature, even when we understand intellectually that a mug is a mug regardless of whether we hold it or merely look at it. Yet our emotions and our sense of proprietorship override this rational knowledge, suggesting that Consider the experience of moving into a new apartment in an unfamiliar neighborhood, where everything feels foreign and slightly uncomfortable at first. From the particular shade of the buildings to the specific rhythm of traffic outside your window to the unique quality of light that filters through the streets at different times of day. You might spend your first weeks actively disliking certain aspects of this environment, perhaps finding the corner store aesthetically unappealing or the coffee shop on your block rather unremarkable compared to places you knew before. However, as months pass and you walk these same routes repeatedly, something curious begins to happen, something that researchers have identified as the mere exposure effect, which suggests that the more frequently we encounter something, the more we tend to develop a preference for it, even without any objective change in the thing itself. The corner store that once seemed plain gradually becomes charming in your mind, the coffee shop transforms into your favorite local spot, and the specific light quality you initially found strange now feels comforting and familiar. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon appears to involve a reduction in cognitive effort and psychological discomfort as our brains become increasingly familiar with a stimulus, making the processing of that stimulus more fluent and efficient, which our minds then interpret as a positive emotional response. This fluency of processing generates a subtle sense of ease and comfort that we attribute to liking the thing itself, when in reality, we are simply experiencing the cognitive comfort of familiarity. We see this effect everywhere in human experience, from our inexplicable attachment to songs that played constantly during particular periods of our lives, to our growing fondness for people we initially disliked but encountered regularly, to our cultural preferences for faces and artistic styles. Imagine walking into a room and meeting two people for the first time, and one of them is strikingly beautiful while the other has an entirely unremarkable appearance. And when you interact with them over the course of an hour, you find yourself attributing all sorts of positive qualities to the beautiful person: intelligence, kindness, honesty, competence, while simultaneously overlooking similar or even superior qualities in the other person, simply because their physical appearance did not create that initial positive impression in your mind. This is the halo effect, a cognitive bias so fundamental to human judgment that it operates almost entirely below the level of conscious awareness, and it demonstrates how a single positive trait, whether that is physical attractiveness, wealth, fame, or social status, can create an almost luminous glow that colors our perception of every other characteristic that person possesses. The mechanism behind this phenomenon emerges from the way our brains are designed to process information efficiently, taking mental shortcuts to conserve cognitive energy when we encounter new people and situations, and our brains unconsciously assume that if someone excels in one visible domain, they are likely to excel in other domains as well, even though there is absolutely no logical connection between these separate abilities. A person might be extraordinarily physically attractive and simultaneously possess terrible judgment, weak moral character, or profound incompetence in their professional field. Yet the halo effect ensures that observers will struggle to see these flaws clearly, instead constructing elaborate justifications for behaviors that would be judged harshly in someone deemed less attractive. What makes this bias particularly persistent despite its logical bankruptcy is that we have built entire cultural and economic systems around it, from entertainment industries that reward physical beauty with disproportionate. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room while a psychologist hands you a detailed personality profile, describing your innermost traits, your hidden desires, and your unique psychological makeup in ways that feel remarkably accurate and deeply personal to you alone. You nod in recognition as you read about how you have a need for other people to like and admire you, how you have a tendency to be critical of yourself, and how you possess untapped potential that you haven't fully realized. The description feels uncannily tailored to who you are, revealing truths about yourself that you've always sensed but never quite articulated. What you don't know is that this identical profile was given to every other person in the room, and it would feel equally accurate to each of them. This is the Barnum effect, a cognitive bias where people accept vague, general, or universal statements about themselves as being specifically accurate and meaningful, particularly when these statements are presented in a personal context and attributed to some form of analysis or expertise. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through several reinforcing psychological channels simultaneously. When we receive personalized feedback, we naturally enter a frame of mind where we actively search for ways to match the information to our self-concept, unconsciously filtering and emphasizing the parts that resonate while dismissing or reinterpreting the parts that don't. We possess a remarkable ability to find personal meaning in broadly applicable statements, because these statements are constructed to reflect common human experiences and emotions that transcend individual differences. Astrology readings, tarot card interpretations, and personality assessments often leverage this effect by using carefully chosen language that applies to the vast majority of people while maintaining an illusion of specificity. Imagine you're sitting in a meeting where your colleague proposes an idea that you find somewhat unusual or even slightly flawed. Yet when you look around the room, you notice that most people seem to be nodding along in agreement, and this observation makes you second-guess your initial skepticism, causing you to assume that perhaps your perspective is the minority view and that the consensus among your peers represents the more accurate understanding of the situation. This is the false consensus effect in motion, a cognitive bias that leads us to overestimate the degree to which our own beliefs, values, and behaviors are shared by others in the general population or in specific groups. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through several interconnected psychological pathways, beginning with our natural tendency to seek out and surround ourselves with people who share similar viewpoints, creating what researchers call a homogeneous social environment that reinforces the illusion that our opinions are far more widespread than they actually are. Additionally, we tend to notice and remember information that confirms our existing beliefs while filtering out or dismissing information that contradicts them, a process known as confirmation bias that works in tandem with the false consensus effect to create a distorted perception of reality. Our minds also engage in a process called availability heuristic, where we judge the frequency or likelihood of something based on how easily examples come to mind. And since we spend most of our time thinking about our own perspectives and interacting with like-minded individuals, these viewpoints become cognitively available and therefore seem more common than they truly are. What makes this bias particularly persistent despite its logical inconsistencies is that it provides us with psychological comfort and social reassurance, allowing us to feel validated and part of a larger consensus, WIC. Imagine walking into a crowded coffee shop wearing a shirt with a small stain on it, and immediately you feel the weight of invisible eyes upon you, convinced that everyone in the room has noticed this imperfection and is forming judgments about your appearance and character based on this single flaw. You spend the next hour acutely aware of your chest, positioning yourself at angles to hide the mark, replaying the moment you discovered it, wondering how long people have been looking at you with quiet disapproval. Yet the reality is far different from your internal experience, because most people in that coffee shop are absorbed in their own conversations, their own phones, their own insecurities and preoccupations, and the vast majority will never notice the stain at all. And those who might happen to glance in your direction are thinking about their own problems rather than cataloging your imperfections. This is the spotlight effect, a cognitive bias in which we dramatically overestimate the degree to which other people notice our appearance, our behavior, and our mistakes. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon stems from the simple fact that we have unparalleled access to our own minds and bodies. We are hyper-aware of our every flaw, every awkward movement, every moment of social discomfort, because we experience these things from the inside, with an intensity and clarity that makes them feel monumentally important and publicly visible. We mistakenly assume that because something feels so prominent and noticeable to us from our internal vantage point, it must surely be equally prominent and noticeable to everyone observing us from the outside. This asymmetry of information and attention creates a persistent illusion, one that survives despite our intellectual understanding that other people are primarily focused on themselves rather than on us. Imagine a parent telling their teenager that they absolutely cannot go to a particular party, that it is completely forbidden, and watch as that simple prohibition transforms the party into the most desirable destination in the entire world, suddenly occupying every waking thought despite the teenager having shown only passing interest before the restriction was announced. This is reactance theory at work, a psychological phenomenon wherein people feel a motivational force to restore their sense of freedom whenever they perceive that their autonomy or freedom of choice has been threatened or restricted by some external force or authority. When someone tells us we cannot do something, we do not simply accept that limitation and move peacefully onward. Instead, we experience an internal resistance to the restriction itself, and that very resistance makes the forbidden option seem more attractive, more valuable, and more worth pursuing than it seemed before the restriction was imposed. The mechanism operates through a fundamental human need for autonomy and control over our own actions and decisions, a need so deeply embedded in our psychology that when it is threatened, we automatically generate motivation to reassert that control and reclaim our freedom. The restriction becomes a challenge to our sense of self-determination, and overcoming that challenge or defying that restriction becomes a way of asserting that our choices are our own, that we are not merely puppets being controlled by external forces, that we retain agency over our own lives. Remarkably, this pattern persists even when we understand it intellectually, even when we recognize that the forbidden item holds no genuine value, even when we can articulate that we are being manipulated by our own psychology into desiring something simply because we have been told we cannot have it. And yet the desire remains, the attraction intensifies, and the psychological pull toward the forbidden. Imagine a child who loves to draw, who spends hours creating pictures for the sheer joy of the creative process, who feels genuinely excited each time they pick up a pencil or marker and begin to express themselves through color and form. Then one day, an adult notices this passion and decides to reward it, offering the child money or prizes each time they produce a drawing, believing that external incentives will encourage and reinforce this wonderful behavior. What happens next is both subtle and profound. The child's intrinsic motivation, that pure and self-generated desire to create, begins to diminish. The drawing itself no longer feels like an end in itself but becomes a means to an external goal, and when the rewards eventually stop, the child often finds that the joy has departed along with them, leaving behind only the hollow memory of what once felt naturally rewarding. This is the overjustification effect, a psychological phenomenon where the introduction of external rewards for an activity that was previously intrinsically motivated actually undermines and weakens that original motivation. The mechanism operates through a cognitive reframing process whereby our minds reinterpret the reasons for our own behavior. And when we receive external justification for doing something we already enjoyed, we unconsciously shift our understanding of why we do it, attributing our actions to the external reward rather than to our internal desires. We begin to think that we must not have truly wanted to do this thing for its own sake. Otherwise, why would we need to be paid or praised for it? And this subtle shift in self-perception erodes the intrinsic satisfaction that once sustained the behavior. This paradox persists in our modern world because we have built entire systems of motivation around external rewards, from education to employment, assuming that adding incentives will always increase engagement, when in fact we are often under. Imagine yourself standing at a crossroads where you must choose between two identical financial outcomes, yet one feels dramatically worse than the other, and this feeling alone changes your entire decision. You are offered two paths. In the first, you are given $100 with certainty, and in the second, you face a coin flip where you win $200 or receive nothing at all. Logically, both paths offer the same expected value of $100, yet most people choose the guaranteed option despite the mathematical equivalence. Now reverse the scenario slightly and tell someone they will lose $100 for certain, or they can take a 50-50 gamble where they might lose $200 or lose nothing. Suddenly, these same cautious people become risk-takers, willing to gamble away their losses rather than accept the certainty of losing. This is loss aversion, and it reveals something profound about human psychology. The pain of losing something weighs roughly twice as heavily as the pleasure of gaining an equivalent amount. The mechanism operates deep within our evolutionary history, where the cost of losing a meal or shelter literally meant death, whereas gaining an extra meal was merely comfort. Our brains developed an asymmetrical response system where threats triggered immediate, intense reactions, while gains were processed more moderately. This ancient survival wiring persists in modern life where the stakes are symbolic rather than existential, yet our nervous systems treat financial losses with the same urgency as our ancestors treated predators. We cling to failing investments because selling them locks in the loss, while holding them preserves the painful possibility of recovery. We stay in unsatisfying relationships because ending them feels like an active loss of time invested, though remaining costs us continued unhappiness. Consider the modern individual scrolling through their phone late into the evening, watching images of friends gathered at restaurants, colleagues celebrating promotions, acquaintances traveling to distant countries, all while they sit alone in their room, and despite knowing they chose to stay home, despite being aware that they are tired and content, something inside them twists with a peculiar anxiety, a sensation that somewhere, somehow, something worthwhile is happening without them. Something that will define their peers while they remain outside the circle of experience. This is the fear of missing out in its most fundamental form, a paradoxical dread that infiltrates even moments of genuine satisfaction, because the human mind has become wired to question whether the present moment is truly the optimal one or merely the acceptable alternative to infinite other possibilities. The mechanism operates through a collision of evolutionary impulse and modern abundance, where our ancestors once needed to monitor group cohesion for survival and belonging, and this instinct persists, but now it faces an unprecedented problem. There are more events, more gatherings, more experiences being documented and shared than any single person could ever attend, creating a mathematical impossibility of complete participation that the anxious mind treats as a personal failure rather than a logical inevitability. We have normalized this condition so thoroughly that young people report feeling genuine distress when unable to document their experiences in real time, as though an experience that was not broadcast to others somehow did not fully occur. And even those who intellectually understand the irrationality of of comparing their internal experience to the curated external presentations of others find themselves unable to fully escape the pull of wondering whether they are inhabiting the right moment. In the right place with the right people, a thought that. Imagine a patient receiving a sugar pill from their doctor, yet instead of experiencing relief, they develop a headache, nausea, or fatigue, despite the substance being entirely inert and containing no active ingredients whatsoever. This is the nocebo effect, the darker mirror of the placebo effect, where negative expectations about a treatment or substance actually produce harmful symptoms in the body, even when no biological mechanism should exist to create such symptoms. A person might read the side effects listed on a medication bottle and begin experiencing those exact symptoms within minutes, their body somehow translating the fear and expectation into genuine physiological responses. Another might be told that a particular food causes migraines and subsequently develop debilitating headaches whenever they consume it, their brain manufacturing the pain through the power of anticipatory dread. The mechanism at work involves the intricate connection between expectation and the nervous system, whereby anticipated harm triggers real neural pathways that can produce inflammation, alter pain perception, suppress immune function, or disrupt normal bodily processes. When you expect something to hurt, your brain becomes hypervigilant, priming your attention toward any bodily sensation and amplifying minor discomforts into significant suffering. The body releases stress hormones in response to this psychological state, creating a cascade of physiological effects that feel entirely real because they are entirely real, despite originating from the mind rather than external toxins. What makes the nocebo effect particularly striking is how it persists despite our intellectual understanding that it operates through expectation alone, revealing a fundamental truth about human consciousness. Our minds possess extraordinary power over our bodies, yet this power operates largely beyond our conscious control or rational override, making the nocebo effect a hum. Imagine you have just completed an exhausting initiation ritual to join an exclusive club, one that required you to endure hours of discomfort, embarrassment, or physical strain. And once you finally pass through that ordeal and become a member, you find the club itself to be rather ordinary, perhaps even disappointing in comparison to what you expected based on the difficulty of entry. Yet instead of feeling regret about the suffering you endured, you find yourself becoming deeply attached to the club, defending it passionately to others, and valuing your membership far more highly than you would have if you had simply walked in without any barriers. This phenomenon, known as effort justification, reveals a fundamental quirk in how our minds construct value and meaning in our lives. When we invest significant effort, pain, time, or resources into obtaining something, our brains appear to unconsciously increase our evaluation of that thing's worth as a way of justifying the investment we have already made, even when the objective quality of the outcome does not match the magnitude of effort expended. The psychological mechanism operates through what researchers call cognitive dissonance reduction, where our minds experience an uncomfortable tension between two conflicting beliefs: the belief that we are rational beings who make sensible decisions, and the observation that we have just suffered greatly for something that may not warrant that suffering. To resolve this internal conflict without admitting to ourselves that we made a poor decision, our minds simply revise upward our assessment of what we worked so hard to obtain, essentially deciding retroactively that the effort must have been worth it because the outcome must be valuable. This logic persists across countless domains of human experience, from the college student who values their degree more highly because of the stress endured to earn it, to the relationship that feels more me. Consider the modern individual who spends their entire working life pursuing the ultimate goal of freedom, imagining a future state in which they have accumulated enough wealth, status, or security to finally live as they wish. Yet when that moment arrives, they find themselves paralyzed by the very absence of constraints they once craved so desperately. The paradox emerges in this peculiar human condition where we convince ourselves that external limitations are the primary obstacles to our happiness and self-expression, only to discover that unlimited choice and boundless possibility can generate anxiety so profound that we unconsciously reconstruct the very boundaries we work to escape. A person might spend decades in a structured career, dreaming of retirement and freedom, imagining all the pursuits they will finally undertake, all the time they will reclaim for themselves. Yet upon reaching that threshold, they experience an overwhelming sense of emptiness and purposelessness because the structure itself, despite feeling constraining, provided direction and identity. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon relates to how humans actually function within frameworks of constraint and meaning rather than within voids of infinite possibility. For the human mind requires scaffolding upon which to build motivation and purpose, and when that scaffolding dissolves, we are left floating in a space too vast to navigate without guidance. We have gradually normalized this paradox by romanticizing freedom as an absolute good while simultaneously demonstrating through our behavior that unlimited freedom often produces paralysis rather than flourishing. Yet we continue to pursue it as though the next increment of liberty will finally solve what the previous increments failed to address, creating an endless cycle of liberation and disillusionment that defines much of the contemporary experience. Imagine a person who believes that their political party is fundamentally more honest than the opposing party, and every news story they encounter is filtered through this lens of expectation. When they read about a scandal involving their own party, they scrutinize the sources, question the methodology, and consider all the contextual factors that might explain or mitigate the situation. But when they read about an identical scandal involving the opposing party, they accept the story at face value, share it immediately, and use it as further evidence of their pre-existing belief. This is not a one-time occurrence, but rather the beginning of a loop that reinforces itself endlessly. Each piece of information they selectively absorb becomes another brick in the wall of their conviction, and each conviction makes them more likely to seek out and accept information that confirms it while dismissing contradictory evidence. The mechanism at work here is that our brains are fundamentally lazy pattern-matching machines designed for survival rather than truth-seeking. We evolved to form quick judgments based on limited information because hesitating in the presence of a predator would have been fatal. This same mental shortcut now works against us in the modern world, where we encounter far too much information to evaluate each claim objectively. Our brains have learned to take shortcuts by relying on what we already believe, treating familiar ideas as true and unfamiliar ones with suspicion. What makes this particularly insidious is that the loop becomes self-sustaining and nearly invisible to the person caught within it. Each confirmation feels like discovery rather than selection. They believe they are thinking critically and carefully evaluating evidence, all while systematically filtering reality through the lens of their existing beliefs. Imagine you've purchased a movie ticket for $20, and as you settle into your seat, you realize within the first 10 minutes that the film is genuinely terrible, poorly written, and painfully slow. Yet you find yourself sitting through the entire 2-hour runtime simply because you've already paid for it, unable to leave despite knowing with absolute certainty that you would be happier doing almost anything else with your remaining time. This is the sunk cost fallacy in its most recognizable form, a cognitive bias where we continue investing time, money, or effort into something primarily because we've already invested resources into it in the past, rather than making decisions based on what would benefit us moving forward. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in how our minds process loss and investment, treating money or time that has already been spent as though it should somehow influence future choices, when in rational terms, past expenditures are entirely irrelevant to present decisions. We tell ourselves that leaving the theater would waste the ticket price, that abandoning a failing business venture would render previous investments meaningless, that staying in an unfulfilling relationship validates the years we've already spent together, when in fact those resources are gone regardless of what we do next. The sunk cost fallacy persists because we experience a psychological discomfort with waste and loss that far outweighs our comfort with future benefit, and we've somehow internalized the belief that throwing good time or money after bad somehow recovers what we've lost, when mathematically and logically it only multiplies the damage. We've normalized this paradox so thoroughly that people stay in situations that actively harm them simply because leaving feels like admitting defeat, when in reality, the most rational choice is always the one that maximizes our well-being from this moment forward, utterly indifferent to why. Consider the peculiar circumstance in which a patient receives a sugar pill, a saline injection, or some other inert substance that contains no active pharmaceutical ingredient whatsoever, yet experiences genuine improvement in their symptoms, whether that improvement manifests as reduced pain, decreased anxiety, improved digestion, or even measurable changes in their physiological markers. This is the placebo effect, and it presents us with a remarkable paradox that sits at the intersection of mind and body. The paradox deepens when we acknowledge that the patient often knows or suspects that they have received a placebo, and yet the effect persists regardless. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves the brain's extraordinary capacity to influence bodily processes through expectation, conditioning, and the intricate web of neurotransmitters that regulate sensation, inflammation, and immune function. When we expect to feel better, our brain releases endogenous opioids and other neurochemicals that genuinely do alleviate symptoms, creating a cascade of physiological changes that are entirely real despite originating from a substance that is chemically inert. The paradox intensifies when we recognize that this effect occurs even when patients are aware of the deception, suggesting that the power of expectation operates beneath conscious awareness, in regions of the mind where belief and biology become indistinguishable. Medicine has normalized this paradox by incorporating placebo controls into clinical trials as the gold standard for testing new treatments, yet simultaneously acknowledging that placebos themselves produce measurable clinical benefits. We have come to accept that the mind can heal the body without physical intervention, that expectation can reshape our experience of pain and illness, and that this process is neither fraud nor miracle, but simply how human physiology has evolved to respond to our internal narratives about. Imagine you are an expert in your field, someone who has spent years mastering intricate details, developing intuitions, and building mental frameworks that now feel automatic and obvious to you. And then someone asks you to explain your work to a complete beginner, and you find yourself struggling not out of lack of knowledge, but because of an overwhelming abundance of it, unable to remember what it felt like to not know. Unable to grasp which pieces are actually foundational and which are simply obvious to you now after years of immersion. This is the curse of knowledge, a cognitive bias where possessing information actually prevents us from imagining what it is like to lack that information, creating an invisible barrier between the expert and the novice that neither party fully understands. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in how human memory and cognition work. For once we know something deeply, that knowledge becomes integrated into our neural networks in such a way that we cannot easily reconstruct the mental state of not knowing it. Our brain essentially files away the learning process itself and presents us only with the finished product, making the gap between ignorance and understanding feel smaller than it actually is. This is why parents often cannot understand why their children find basic tasks confusing, why teachers sometimes present information in ways that leave students baffled, why software designers create interfaces that seem intuitive to them but mystify their users, each person operating from a different informational foundation while assuming their perspective is universally accessible. What makes this paradox particularly persistent is that it operates invisibly. The curse itself obscures our awareness of its existence. We genuinely believe we are explaining things clearly because from our vantage point they are clear, and we cannot feel the absence of knowledge we no longer possess, we cannot ment. Imagine a person who has spent years working toward a singular goal, perhaps the acquisition of a dream home or a promotion to a position they have long desired, and when that moment finally arrives, when they stand in the doorway of their new house or sit at their new desk, there is a profound sense of accomplishment that fills them completely. Yet within weeks or months, that intense feeling of joy and satisfaction begins to fade, and they find themselves returning to a baseline emotional state that feels almost identical to how they felt before achieving their goal, despite the objective circumstances of their life having fundamentally improved. This phenomenon is known as hedonic adaptation or the hedonic treadmill, and it represents one of the most curious and persistent patterns in human psychology. The mechanism behind this experience operates through a neurological process in which our brains continuously recalibrate their expectations and reference points based on new circumstances. When we achieve something we have long anticipated, our nervous system registers this as a significant change, flooding us with dopamine and creating a state of heightened contentment. But as time passes, our brain begins to treat this new condition as the normal baseline, the expected standard against which all future experiences are measured. This adaptation served our ancestors well, allowing them to remain motivated and alert to genuine dangers and opportunities even after achieving safety or acquiring resources. Yet in the modern world, it creates an endless cycle in which we pursue achievement after achievement, only to discover that each new accomplishment provides diminishing returns of lasting satisfaction. We construct our entire lives around this treadmill, believing that the next salary increase, the next purchase, the next milestone will finally deliver the permanent happiness we seek, yet the evidence suggests that most people return to there. Consider the person standing before a menu at an unfamiliar restaurant, reading through dozens of options with increasing intensity, their eyes scanning prices and descriptions over and over again, mentally constructing scenarios of satisfaction or regret depending on what they choose, unable to commit to a single dish despite having been there for 10 minutes already. Or consider the student who has gathered 17 sources for their essay and continues to read and reread them, highlighting passages, taking notes on their notes, reorganizing their outline for the fifth time, acutely aware that the deadline approaches yet feeling fundamentally incapable of beginning to write because they have not yet achieved complete certainty about their argument. These are quiet manifestations of analysis paralysis, where the pursuit of the optimal decision becomes so consuming that no decision emerges at all. The mechanism operates through a peculiar inversion of rationality itself. When faced with multiple options, the mind naturally calculates potential outcomes and consequences, weighing the value of each choice against the others. Yet somewhere in this rational process, a loop forms where each new piece of information or perspective seems to complicate the decision rather than clarify it, creating a recursive cycle of evaluation that feeds endlessly upon itself. The person becomes aware that they lack complete information, so they seek more information, but more information only reveals how much more information might exist beyond their current reach. The fear of making a wrong choice, of missing a better option, transforms the simple act of deciding into an existential task requiring omniscience. What makes this paradox particularly strange is that most everyday choices genuinely do not warrant such analysis. Imagine a woman collapses on a crowded city street during the middle of the day, surrounded by dozens of people who witness her fall to the ground. In this moment, you might expect that the sheer number of witnesses would guarantee that someone would immediately rush to help, call emergency services, or at minimum check on her condition. Yet paradoxically, the opposite often occurs. The more people present at the scene of an emergency, the less likely any single individual is to take action or offer assistance. This phenomenon, extensively documented through psychological research and real-world tragedy, reveals a troubling truth about human behavior in the presence of others. When a person is alone and witnesses an emergency, they typically feel a strong sense of personal responsibility and will intervene without hesitation. But as soon as additional witnesses arrive, something shifts in the minds of those present. The responsibility becomes diffused across the group, and each individual begins to rationalize their inaction by assuming someone else will help. This diffusion of responsibility operates on an unconscious level, where your brain automatically distributes the burden of action among all present observers. Beyond mere responsibility diffusion, the bystander effect also involves pluralistic ignorance, where individuals look to the reactions of others to gauge whether a situation is truly an emergency. When everyone around you appears calm and unmoved, you begin to question your own interpretation of events, wondering if perhaps the situation is not as serious as you initially thought. The presence of others becomes a kind of mirror through which you evaluate reality, and if that mirror reflects collective inaction, your instinct to help diminishes. We have normalized this response despite its logical contradiction, accepting that crowds paradoxically create isolation from our own moral imperatives. Imagine a society built entirely on the principle of tolerance, where citizens celebrate diversity and embrace the freedom of all people to express their views without constraint or limitation. Yet within this framework of absolute permissiveness emerges a troubling question that philosophers have grappled with for decades. Should a tolerant society extend tolerance to those who would use that very freedom to dismantle tolerance itself, to those whose ideologies are fundamentally intolerant and seek to suppress the voices and rights of others? This is the paradox of tolerance, a logical knot that tightens the more we examine it. For if we tolerate the intolerant with complete and unconditional acceptance, we inevitably create the conditions for our own tolerance to be eroded and eventually destroyed by those who reject its foundational premises. Consider the real-world manifestations of this dilemma. A democratic nation must decide whether to permit hate speech that demeans and dehumanizes minority groups, knowing that protecting such speech might ultimately lead to the oppression of those very minorities if intolerant movements gain sufficient power and influence. The mechanism at work here involves a kind of logical recursion where tolerance, when applied universally without boundaries, contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction, creating a situation where the very virtue we seek to cultivate becomes the instrument of its own undoing. What makes this paradox so psychologically unsettling is that there appears to be no clean solution, no obvious answer that preserves both absolute tolerance and absolute safety for all people simultaneously. Yet we continue to approach these questions as though reasoned debate alone will illuminate the path forward. Imagine you are lying in bed at night, desperately wanting to fall asleep, and suddenly you become hyper-aware of your breathing, your heartbeat, the sensation of the sheets against your skin, and no matter how hard you try to ignore these sensations and drift into unconsciousness, they only become more prominent and more intrusive in your mind, keeping you awake for hours while you wrestle with the very thing you were trying to suppress. This is the essence of ironic process theory, a psychological phenomenon first formally described by Daniel Wegner in the 1980s, which explains how the conscious attempt to suppress a thought, emotion, or sensation paradoxically amplifies its presence and makes it impossible to ignore. The mechanism works like this. When you try not to think about something, your mind must first access and acknowledge that very thing in order to monitor whether you are successfully not thinking about it, which means the suppressed thought becomes the focus of your attention precisely when you are trying to make it disappear, creating a recursive loop where suppression and intrusion feed each other in an endless cycle. The harder you push the thought away, the more your mind must engage with it to check if your suppression is working, and this checking process becomes a form of thinking about the thing you wanted to avoid in the first place. This theory explains countless everyday experiences. The person who is told not to think of a white elephant immediately visualizes one in vivid detail. The anxious individual who tries not to worry about a test performance only becomes more anxious and hyper-aware of their racing thoughts. The insomniac who desperately tries to force sleep only to find themselves more alert and conscious than ever before. Consider the person who deeply values their health while simultaneously smoking a pack of cigarettes each day, or the individual who believes in environmental conservation yet drives an inefficient vehicle across town for minor errands, or perhaps someone who advocates fiercely for honesty in relationships while maintaining a secret that contradicts their stated values. These scenarios represent a fundamental tension within the human mind known as cognitive dissonance, a state of psychological discomfort that arises when we hold two or more conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes simultaneously, or when our actions contradict our stated principles. The mechanism operates beneath conscious awareness most of the time, creating a subtle but persistent mental friction that our minds work constantly to resolve or minimize. When confronted with this internal conflict, we typically employ one of several defense mechanisms to reduce the discomfort. We might minimize the importance of one belief, rationalize our behavior by reinterpreting its significance, selectively attend to information that supports our preferred narrative, or simply deny the contradiction exists altogether. The paradox deepens when we recognize that this tendency persists even when we possess full awareness of the contradiction and access to objective information that would resolve it in our favor. We have normalized this psychological inconsistency to such an extent that most people experience it daily without truly acknowledging its presence or the elaborate mental gymnastics required to maintain the illusion of coherence. The human mind remains remarkably efficient at constructing narratives that allow us to feel at peace with our contradictions, transforming logical impossibilities into manageable psychological states through the simple act of not looking too closely at what we are doing. Consider the student who enters an examination hall convinced that they will fail because they have internalized the belief that they are simply not good at mathematics, a conviction formed years earlier when a teacher made an offhand comment about their abilities during a single difficult lesson. This student sits down, opens the exam paper, and immediately feels a wave of anxiety wash over them, their hands trembling slightly as they read the first problem. Their mind, already primed by expectation, interprets the difficulty of the question as confirmation of their inadequacy rather than as a normal part of the assessment process. They spend minutes staring at the problem, their confidence eroding with each passing second, until eventually they skip it entirely and move to the next question, where the same pattern repeats. By the end of the examination, they have answered fewer questions than they are capable of answering, and they fail, just as they predicted they would. The prophecy has fulfilled itself, not because of any genuine limitation in their mathematical ability, but because the expectation itself became a self-imposed obstacle that redirected their attention inward toward their doubts rather than outward toward the problems themselves. The mechanism is remarkably simple yet profoundly powerful. Our beliefs about ourselves shape our behaviors in subtle ways, and those behaviors produce outcomes that appear to confirm our original beliefs, creating a closed loop that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. The person who believes they are socially awkward becomes hypervigilant to signs of rejection, misinterpreting neutral social cues as evidence of disinterest, withdrawing from interactions, and thereby creating the very isolation they feared. Consider the person who structures their entire existence around the pursuit of pleasure, who carefully arranges each day to maximize enjoyment and minimize discomfort, who believes that happiness is simply the accumulation of pleasant experiences and the avoidance of pain. This individual might spend considerable energy seeking out luxury, comfort, entertainment, and gratification, tracking their satisfaction like a ledger, always aware of whether they are in the positive or negative column of pleasure. Yet despite this meticulous attention to their own happiness, despite the deliberate cultivation of joyful moments and the careful elimination of friction from their life, something peculiar emerges. They often find themselves empty, dissatisfied, and oddly more miserable than someone who pursued pleasure only as a byproduct of other meaningful goals. This is the paradox of hedonism, a logical knot that has perplexed philosophers and psychologists for centuries. The mechanism at work here operates on a subtle psychological principle. Pleasure and happiness are not destinations that can be reached through direct pursuit, but rather they are involuntary consequences of engaging in activities that contain inherent meaning, challenge, or connection to something beyond oneself. When you chase pleasure directly, you become hyper-aware of the gap between your current state and your desired state, which creates a constant low-level anxiety and anticipation that paradoxically undermines the very satisfaction you seek. The hedonic treadmill compounds this effect, as each moment of pleasure becomes normalized and expected, requiring ever greater stimulation to produce the same effect, while simultaneously the awareness of this requirement creates a sense of desperation and inauthenticity. Imagine a person who has spent years building expertise in their field, someone who has earned degrees, published work, received promotions, and earned the respect of their peers. Yet when they sit in a meeting or receive praise for their accomplishments, they feel an overwhelming sense of fraudulence, a deep conviction that they do not truly belong where they are, that their success is merely the result of luck or timing or somehow fooling others into overestimating their abilities, and that soon, inevitably, everyone will discover that they are fundamentally incompetent. This person experiences what psychologists call impostor syndrome, a peculiar form of psychological distress in which objectively successful individuals persistently doubt their own competence and attribute their achievements to external factors rather than to their own skill or intelligence. The mechanism underlying this paradox is fascinating because it involves a fundamental distortion in how the mind processes evidence about itself. When someone with imposter syndrome receives recognition or achieves a goal, their brain automatically reinterprets this success as either a fluke, an accident of circumstance, or a result of having deceived others into believing they are more capable than they actually are. Meanwhile, their failures or mistakes are absorbed directly into their self-concept as confirmation of their true inadequacy. This creates an asymmetrical processing system where positive evidence is systematically discounted while negative evidence is overweighted, a cognitive mechanism that should theoretically be correctable through logical examination of the evidence, yet it persists stubbornly regardless of how much success accumulates. What makes imposter syndrome particularly paradoxical is that the very traits that contribute to genuine achievement often fuel it simultaneously. Imagine a novice chess player who has learned the basic rules and played perhaps a dozen casual games, yet confidently believes they could compete reasonably well against experienced tournament players, while a grandmaster with thousands of hours of study and competition experience expresses measured uncertainty about their own abilities and acknowledges the vast complexity they still have yet to master. This counterintuitive gap between competence and confidence represents one of the most pervasive and humbling patterns in human psychology, a phenomenon where those with the least knowledge often possess the greatest certainty about their knowledge, while those with genuine expertise tend toward appropriate humility and recognition of their limitations. The mechanism underlying this curious inversion operates through a deceptively simple process. When we lack expertise in a domain, we simply do not possess the cognitive framework necessary to recognize the gaps in our understanding, and therefore we cannot accurately assess what we do not know. A person with minimal understanding of immunology cannot see the intricate details and nuanced complexities that would reveal their own ignorance, because the very knowledge required to recognize ignorance is the knowledge they lack. Meanwhile, as someone progresses through genuine learning and skill development, they encounter increasingly sophisticated concepts and applications, which paradoxically reveals to them how much deeper the field extends beyond their current mastery, creating an expanding circle of recognized unknowns that properly tempers their confidence. This psychological pattern persists with remarkable consistency across virtually every human domain, from academic subjects to professional skills to social competence to medical knowledge, suggesting something fundamental about how human consciousness relates to expertise. Imagine yourself standing in a grocery store aisle, facing a wall of jam jars stretching before you in an almost infinite array of flavors, textures, and price points, and you find yourself unable to make a decision despite the abundance of options that should theoretically make you happier and more satisfied. You stand there frozen, comparing labels, reading reviews on your phone, second-guessing your preferences, and eventually walking away without purchasing anything at all, or selecting something hastily while feeling uncertain about your choice. This is the paradox of choice, where an increase in available options beyond a certain threshold actually decreases our satisfaction, increases our decision paralysis, and amplifies our regret. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox operates through several interconnected pathways. As options multiply, the cognitive load required to evaluate them all becomes overwhelming, forcing our minds to either narrow focus arbitrarily or abandon the decision entirely. Additionally, with more choices comes greater opportunity cost awareness, meaning we become acutely conscious of all the alternatives we are rejecting, which transforms any selection into a loss of possibilities rather than a pure gain. Our expectations also rise proportionally with choice abundance, making us less satisfied with whatever we eventually select because we imagine the unchosen options might have been superior. Perhaps most persistently, we internalize responsibility for our choice in ways that breed regret and self-blame, convincing ourselves that if we had simply deliberated longer or researched more thoroughly, we could have found the objectively perfect option. We have normalized this paralysis as an expected part of modern life, framing overwhelming choice as a luxury problem, rather than recognizing it as a genuine source of psychological distress and decision fatigue that touches nearly every domain of contemporary.